Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to our government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Honorable members, we will now be led in God Save the Queen by Brooklyn Allard. Please refrain from joining as per the COVID-19 health restrictions. Honorable members, please remain standing. Over the past year, Albertans have faced many challenges and endured tremendous loss due to COVID-19. More than 136,000 Albertans have fought COVID-19 during the past 12 months, and sadly, 1,926 people in our province lost that fight. Today, our flags fly at half-mast in recognition of March 11th, 2021 as the National Day of Observance for those who lost their lives, as well as for all Albertans who have been significantly impacted by the global pandemic. We're all anxious for life to return to what we once knew as normal, but it is essential that we remember those whom that will not be possible. Until then, we recognize the strength, commitment, and resiliency of Albertans as we continue to face this crisis and carry the burdens for others. A moment of silence. Thank you. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests. Ministerial statements.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I rise to commemorate a momentous occasion today. And I'd like to first thank two people, Elder Brian Little, Chief, as well as Krista White, who helped me with this. Okay. Zik da sidak, onok jasigu, kiakoko zi chips sataso wa, amokse, ugaks zi mix, umgo yisi, kiniksi, siksikawa, otsi nemu wix, magu gide, doma ni stabo dagiga, ak zidak gisu gabi, suksa stami beta pisin, anistek, ide sugina, geyabo dagio bisi, amkok, awachu chi gagimop, oki, nido nibin nan, gi iguda mabiwak, agedo manista wegos, agedo manista kasim satosi, anak siksikawa. Kiagu mikse stawak si ma, isodak si sikawa, amok suksi beda bisin, gian nagani notsi debod I, kiayak, chide napska boa, dayak sabi chinan, deya gugaks chi mado binan, makchidak ji gisu gabisi, suksi beda bisin, gane siksa, gena siksika, amok, ogaks chiman, nide duts stabitsin nan, gi, nida nibenan amudstik, itsabawago bawawago bitsi, suk sibeda bisits, ko chidak gi sugabia, mustej gi, ugaks, chimek, ki siksikawa, chi nemuix, mots gayi, agakso gaptomiao, amuk ugaks chiman, nidu chista chinnan siksikawa, uxchi nede bitsi buyiya, nakchidawa kasi mugenan, manistak dubuwa ak gitu gabi. Siksi, gay beda bisen, giyanak is sudak, siksikawa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to the Honourable the Minister of Health. A translation, should any member choose to wish to receive that, are available on the tablings tables. And if you would be so inclined and you would like to have one delivered to you, please feel free to raise your hand. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Minister. It's nice to hear Blackfoot spoken in the legislature. I begin by acknowledging that we are speaking on Treaty 6 traditional territory and land significant to the Métis people, and to acknowledge that today's announcement concerns the interests of the Siksika Nation that live in the Treaty 7 traditional territory. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Siksika Chief and Council on the occasion of signing this Memorandum of Understanding. I'm led to understand that the MOU will allow the nation to work with the government on improving health outcomes and services to nation members. This outcome is certainly a laudable one. As we know, the health outcomes in Indigenous communities have been consistently below the health outcomes achieved in non-Indigenous communities. We are also aware that the cause of this differential in health outcomes can be traced back to a terrible history of colonization of the Siksika people and other First Nations in Alberta. The Siksika Nation was subject to numerous human rights violations, which included the taking of land, the suppression of culture, and other illegal actions that have been described as Canada's hidden genocide. The Siksika Nation was prevented from engaging in ceremonies like the Sundance under penalty of law. They are prevented from leaving the reserve without permission from the Indian agent. They saw thousands of their children taken from their homes and sent to residential schools where they experienced cultural oppression, physical and sexual abuse, and ultimately the death of their children in high numbers. The 60 Scoop and ongoing systemic racism further resulted in a loss of culture, the destruction of families, and waves of negative health outcomes. This is why, when in government, we made the decision to take significant strides in seeking reconciliation with the Siksika Nation and other Indigenous communities in Alberta. In June 2015, the very month we were sworn in, then Premier Notley made the only apology by an Alberta government for the abuses of the residential schools. In May 2018, then Premier Notley made an apology to the survivors of the 60 Scoop and provided resources for the creation of the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta, which is headed up by Blackfoot member Adam North Pagan. Throughout our tenure in government, we sought to advance reconciliation through the implementation of many of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Inquiry and the articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These steps include the signing of the first protocol agreement with the Blackfoot Confederacy, the creation of the Indigenous Climate Leadership Initiative, the start of the Indigenous Housing Program, the Clean Water Tie-In Program, the Indigenous Community-Based Opioid Program, the inclusion of Indigenous culture, knowledge, and traditions in the K-12 curriculum, and over 100 other programs. Thus, we were very concerned to learn that the current government has made the choice to either discontinue or fade out many of these steps to reconciliation. The Department of Indigenous Relations has lost 25% of its staff, and many programs have been severely curtailed or been completely eliminated. It makes me happy, therefore, to hear the success of the Chief and Council of Siksika First Nation. I hope the signing of the MOU and the subsequent actions help to lead this province toward taking real action on reconciliation with the ultimate goal of good health, strong families, and a vibrant culture at Siksika First Nation.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford. deferred. I would like to draw the attention of honourable members in the Assembly to the presence in the Speaker's Gallery of Chief Crowfoot from Siksika Nation and 2 other members from the nation. Okay, welcome to the Assembly. Honourable members, please welcome them.
Member statements.
The honourable member for Edmonton Ellerslie has the call.
Mr. Speaker, today marks the 1-year anniversary since the World Health Organization declared that we were in a pandemic. This COVID-19 public health crisis has impacted every facet of our lives. It has kept us apart. It has caused us to miss major milestones. It has been hard, no doubt. I want to extend the deepest condolences of Alberta's NDP to the family and friends of 1,928 souls who have died as a result of this virus. The loss of these Albertans touched every corner of our province. The pain and suffering has been unimaginable. Let us all in this legislature pledge to honor their lives with a commitment to do better as we move forward and to never let something like this happen again. Mr. Speaker, I must say too, though, that it is the most difficult circumstances that we see when Albertans rise to the occasion. We see the very best that this province has to offer. And I'm so thankful for the tens of thousands of frontline healthcare heroes who headed into chaos and put their own lives on the line to save others. I'm thankful for the grocery store workers who helped us keep food on our tables. I'm thankful for the people who worked in shelters, who drove buses, who taught our kids. The list goes on and on. On a personal note, I'm thankful to be alive. I'm thankful my family is healthy after our battle with COVID-19. We must live on with the lessons of this past year. We must commit to never allow the loss of life we've seen to happen again. And we must continue to support each other. This pandemic is far from over. So, Mr. Speaker, I encourage every member of this House and every Albertan to take a moment to think of the lives lost, to think of the heroes that emerged, and to focus on the hope on the horizon. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary-Klein has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently I had the chance to do an outreach walk with Be the Change Calgary. Chad Smith, their executive director, and his team of volunteer social workers, addiction workers, and other professionals that go out on the coldest nights. I witnessed amazing acts of compassion and care as his team crawled under bridges, wandered down back alleys, looked under staircases, and swept the riverbank, looking to help those who need it the most. They provided referrals, essential supplies, transportation, and hope. This week, from March 7th to the 13th, is Social Work Week. I would like to recognize the hard work and tremendous contributions of our province's social workers and those who work alongside them in the compassion field. Social workers do an incredible job supporting vulnerable Albertans in difficult situations, work that has continued throughout COVID-19, work that has been made harder because of COVID-19. The theme for this year's Social Work Week is Social Work is Essential, which couldn't be more fitting. Working in difficult and uncertain conditions, social workers and their colleagues have answered the challenge with dedication, empathy, professionalism to support our province's most vulnerable citizens during these difficult times. Alberta's more than 7,000 social workers play an essential role by supporting families to keep children, youth, victims of domestic violence, and the homeless safe, and to help people with disabilities reach their full potential. During this week, I encourage the members of this House, my constituents, and all Albertans across the province to remember the hard work and immense contribution of these dedicated professionals. Please join me in celebrating Social Work Week 2021 by recognizing and thanking our social workers and their colleagues across this province. For me, thank you.
The honourable member for Airdrie East has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy Alberta Francophony Month. Did you know that Alberta has the 3rd largest minority Francophone population in Canada? The first settlers to Alberta were French Canadian. French was the first European language spoken in Alberta. The deep-rooted origins remain evident in society today, as 418,000 Albertans are of French or French Canadian descent. Since the 1970s, Alberta's thriving economy has attracted several thousand Francophones from across Canada. French may be a minority language in Alberta, but it is firmly entrenched and has been for over 200 years. The Rouleauville neighbourhood reminds Albertans of the French roots of Calgary, as part of the first permanent mission of merchants and missionaries was to establish Fort Brisbois, which was named Fort Calgary later in 1872. The Franco-Albertan flag was designed by Jean-Pierre Grenier and adopted by the French-Canadian Association of Alberta in 1982. The flag embodies the colours of the French flag with a white fleur-de-lis and a red wild rose. Francophones made a great contribution to the development of Calgary and Alberta, which signifies the rich cultural fabric of our country. 1 in 3 Alberta students are learning French, making it the most commonly learned language in Alberta schools, and the overall number of Alberta students enrolled in French language programs is rising steadily. Alberta's own École Francophone de Airdrie is bursting at the seams with 455 students from K-12, and hundreds more are enrolled in French immersion in Airdrie and surrounding area. The Francophonie community is a historic and essential part of our nation and provincial identity. I am proud that Airdrie is home to many who share this heritage and that our youth are learning more about the importance of keeping the Francophone culture alive and thriving. I look forward to being able to enjoy some tasty maple syrup taffy at the Sugar Shack soon. Joyeux mois de la francophonie albertaine à tous et à tous.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Stay home and save lives. That was the message of this UCP government for Albertans over Christmas, when they imposed an advisory against non-essential travel outside of Canada. The UCP thought this advisory and this advice somehow did not apply to them, and some of them said aloha to their constituents and jetted off as soon as the coast was clear. When they returned, claiming embarrassment and attempting to apologize, they got a slap on the wrist from the Premier, who claimed that he had no way of knowing who had traveled. Except that's not what the facts show, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's Chief of Staff told ministers to inform him of his vacation plans, as they should. The Premier's Chief of Staff had public servants set up a rush phone plan for his own vacation during the pandemic, while regular people were unable to visit their loved ones. The Premier's Chief of Staff told the Premier on his way to the airport that he was leaving the country during the pandemic, while Albertans were not able to celebrate with their lifelong friends. He resigned. The Premier said he was removed from office, and Albertans rightly expected to see the consequences for this type of behavior. But instead of consequences, the Premier gave the same Chief of Staff a $60,000 severance package, paid for by the people of Alberta. Turns out in the UCP, you can violate the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, leave the country during a global pandemic, and walk away with a $60,000 check. The Premier claims the Chief of Staff did not do anything unethical. The UCP abandoned the people of Alberta this Christmas. The Premier, the Health Minister said we're all in this together. While they were telling Albertans to cancel Christmas plans, stay away from family, the Premier's Chief of Staff was planning his international vacation and adjusting his phone plan. If that's not unethical, I don't know what is.
Honourable members, the time is 1:50, and that makes it oral question period. And the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks 1 year since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic. We've lost more than 1,900 Albertans, and our condolences go to their families. A new report shows that while fatalities were contained in the first wave, they were not in the second. In fact, the data shows that last fall, Alberta led the country in the rate of what they call excess deaths. So, to the Premier, can he tell the House how he will ensure that the mistakes of the fall will never be repeated?
The Honourable the Minister of Health has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, before I answer the question, just to, as you did, Mr. Speaker, to note that today is the National Day of Remembrance for those that we've lost to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as of March 9th, as you said, Mr. Speaker, 1,928 Albertans have died in the pandemic, including 5 staff members in our continuing care facilities. And their loved ones will hold each of them in their hearts. And as the province, we will honour them by working to protect Albertans and by working to strengthen our continuing care system as well as the health system as a whole.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that applies to what I'm about to ask. The majority of Albertans that we lost, in fact, were seniors living in long-term and continuing care. Many were in private facilities where long-standing problems with staffing and quality of care took their toll. There must be a great reckoning in this country, a realization that we are failing seniors. To date, the Premier has ignored our calls for a public inquiry in Alberta, but will he at least join the calls for a national inquiry into seniors' care? And if not, why not?
The Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, and first of all, I note that some of the worst outbreaks and some of the worst outcomes that we've had in continuing care actually happened in facilities that were publicly owned by AHS. But we have been the first jurisdiction to begin a review of our response to the pandemic. We look forward to making that report public as soon as we can. We have also done and started in 2019, before the pandemic, a review of the continuing care system. This fall, hopefully being able to table legislation to have a Continuing Care Act, as well as a review of the relationship that we have with our operators throughout the system.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The report also touched on people with addictions. Quote, people who use substances and people who have mental health issues typically die a lot younger than people who don't. We know what we need to do. We know harm reduction works. Mr. Speaker, that's U of C Professor Katrina Mullaney highlighting how the pandemic has raised the risk of deaths in Albertans struggling with addictions. Every Albertan who dies overdosing alone is someone who will never get the chance at recovering. So, to the Premier, will he recognize that harm reduction is the first, most critical action in preventing death, and will he expand capacity and save lives?
Minister of Health.
Speaker, this speaks to the ideology of the NDP that they think that somehow by also having and adding a focus on recovery and having a recovery-oriented system of care is somehow taking away or removing harm reduction as one of the tools to respond to the opioid crisis. Obviously, we'll continue to include harm reduction as one of the tools. It's part of a spectrum of care that we can provide to people who suffer from addiction, but we can add recovery as one of the tools and have harm reduction as one of the many opportunities for us to be able to treat those who suffer from addiction.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition for a second set of questions.
Mr. Speaker, we know Alberta has been struggling under the weight of a decades-long failure of former Conservative governments to build schools. We had to work double time in our government to begin catching up, but this Premier seems to be reverting to the same mistakes of the past. Our fastest-growing urban neighbourhoods in our biggest cities were underserved in this budget. Modular classrooms, once a last resort to address growing pressures, are now being celebrated. Why are our kids in school the last priority on this government's list?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure has risen.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I'm happy to report yesterday we announced 14 new schools across the province. And even in Calgary, we are creating 5,000 new spaces. There are 5 schools underway, and there are a few more schools in Edmonton. Mr. Speaker, it's an ongoing process, and there are capital plans in future budget cycles too, and whichever schools didn't make it to this year, they'll make to the next ones.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Quote, we are one of the fastest growing school divisions in Alberta, and the decision to not fund any of our infrastructure projects will impact students, staff and families. That's Tricia Esterbrook's chair of the Edmonton Public School Board. They're the second largest school division in the province, but the Premier gave them $0 to build, modernize or replace their schools. Premier, first the U of A and now Edmonton Public. There's a pattern here and it doesn't look good. Why is this government punishing Edmonton?
Minister of Infrastructure.
So, Mr. Speaker, I can provide the list of schools underway in Edmonton to the official opposition leader. And also, Mr. Speaker, in addition to the 14 schools we announced yesterday, there are 62 more under different stages of construction. So in total, we are investing $1.6 billion in the future of our students and in the future of Albertans, Mr. Speaker.
The Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe the government's problem is just cities altogether. The CBE is the largest school division in the province, and apart from funding the sale of a school, they got zero, nada. Not even for Northwest Calgary, which is experiencing explosive growth. Premier, If you canceled your $30 million a year war room right now, today, you could fund that school, and next year you could fund another one, and another one, and another one after that. So why don't you do that? Just where is this government's priorities?
The Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, exactly that is what we are doing. 62 schools already underway. We added 14 more. And the member opposite would realize we are running a deficit of $18 billion this year on the top of $20 billion we ran last year. And our debt is going to hit $130 billion. So I ask Albertans to work with Alberta Education, which evaluates school projects on several objective metrics. It is done in conjunction with the school boards, and we are working on it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition for her third set of questions.
Well, I'll agree the energy war room does contribute to the deficit. You know, the budget is full of hypocrisy. On one hand, the Premier is funding a new secretariat dedicated to promoting our international reputation on environmental, social, and governance performance. On the other hand, he's funding a war room and an inquiry dedicated to undermining our international reputation on environmental, social, and governance performance. The Premier appears to be at odds with himself. So why won't he abandon his embarrassing war room, stop his inquiry, save the money, and do the actual work to restore our reputation?
The Honourable the Minister of Energy has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP are so angry. Wouldn't it be nice if instead of being angry at the war room, they actually talked about all the good things our oil and gas industry has done in the province, like the billions of dollars that the industry has put towards R&D and environmental protection is $24 billion in the last 10 years. Why don't they talk about that? The fact that our industry is the leader in carbon capture projects, the Quest project of 5 million tons and the ACTL of 1 million tons. Mr. Speaker, they should talk about
the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, that wasn't relevant, but anyway, here's another hypocrisy. You claim to be a new convert to the relevance of ESG efforts to the goal of attracting jobs and investment to the energy sector. But he also introduced a budget that eliminated every single performance measure related to emissions in our energy sector. Transparency, gone. Accountability, gone. Governance, performance, gone. This change hurts our international credibility. So, will the Premier commit today to restore these performance measures to their business plan to help our international reputation and our energy sector?
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that question is completely and utterly ridiculous. We still have emission targets inside this province. Mr. Speaker, in fact, this province, the province of Alberta, was the first province in Confederation, in fact, the first province or any jurisdiction in North America to bring in any emission management, Mr. Speaker. We continue to move forward on climate change, hand in hand with our industry, innovating our way through the problem. A significant difference between that and what the former government did, the former NDP government did, which was to tax hockey moms and hockey dads, bring forward no real technology solutions when it comes to climate change, Mr. Speaker. We're doing a heck of a lot better than that.
The Leader of the Opposition.
They were in writing, and now they're not. But here's another hypocrisy, and this one's a head-scratcher. To accomplish their work on ESG, the Premier awarded a sole source contract to the Eurasia Group. For those following along at home, the Eurasia Group's newest VP is Gerald Butts, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. 2 years ago, the Premier called ESG a fad. Today, he's hiring Justin Trudeau's childhood friend to show him how it's done. Mr. Speaker, how things have changed. No further questions.
The Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, coming from Justin Trudeau's closest ally, and as far as I know, closest friend in the province of Alberta, who spent her entire premiership going out of their way to sell out the province of Alberta to Justin Trudeau, Mr. Speaker, I'm not even going to bother to answer that question, Mr. Speaker, because what the honourable member is trying to do is distract from the fact that the Conference Board of Canada has joined BMO today in announcing that they believe that Alberta will have the strongest economic recovery in the province, Mr. Speaker. Or in the country, I should say. We're focused on getting Alberta back to work. They're focused on fear and smear.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar has a question.
One of Canada's natural wonders is our Rocky Mountains, and we are fortunate to have them in our backyard. Coal mining and these wonders are a bad juxtaposition. Those aren't my words, Mr. Speaker, but those of Clearwater County Councillor Teresa Lang, whose council sent a letter to the Environment Minister protesting his plans to strip mine the eastern slopes. I would be remiss if I didn't note that Clearwater County's residents are constituents of the Environment Minister who has ignored their concerns. Minister, can you explain to your own community why you're ignoring their concerns on coal mining?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, look at their surprise. Their surprise should be that we're going to be going out to consult with Albertans, including the residents in the Minister of Environment's constituency, to ask for their views on coal, which, after the NDP told coal proponents that there were no restrictions on surface coal mine development. May 24th, 2016, in a total subversion of the 1976 coal policy, one letter, they say the coal category 2 designation does not preclude surface mining. Mr. Speaker, they never read the coal.
Order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar has the call.
The Environment Minister can't run and hide from these questions, Mr. Speaker. Another county councillor in Clearwater County, Cami Laird, said that she is looking forward to actually having a voice on plans to strip mine the eastern slopes after this UCP government's secret deals with billionaire coal companies were uncovered. But it should be stated that this government initiated the plan to destroy our Rocky Mountains without any discussion at all with the residents of Clearwater County or any other residents of the province for that matter. The minister doesn't want to give any answers on this question, so let me ask the Premier. Premier, explain why you felt you had the authority to strip mine our Rocky Mountains.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pretty sure the honourable member doesn't know where Clearwater County is, but what I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, is not one coal mine is even being applied for in the entire county of Clearwater. While the official opposition and the NDP continue to want to make things up, the Honourable Minister of Energy is right. Underneath the NDP government, they sent out a letter to people that actually wanted to build strip mines within Clearwater County, saying they could on Category 2 lands. What the Energy Minister has done now is brought in a consultation process, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that her coal policy is in line with what Albertans want.
Order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans want answers from the Premier, but apparently he has executive time scheduled today. Mr. Speaker, the backlash against this government's secret strip mining plot goes well beyond Clearwater County. Almost 30 communities have spoken out against this rescindment of the 76 coal policy. Our caucus has heard from tens of thousands of Albertans about this government's terrible decision. Premier, did you really think you were going to tear down the Rocky Mountains without controversy? Did you think that Albertans wouldn't notice that the mountains were gone? I'm asking you now to go even further. Will you commit here and now to banning coal mining in all designated categories?
A point of order was noted at 2:02. The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to starting consultations with Albertans on March 29th, broad-based consultations to find out their views on coal mining in Alberta. But I'll point out again that obviously the NDP want to rewrite history and they want to ignore the fact that they were the ones to tell coal companies that there is no restrictions to surface mining, strip mining, and Category 2 lands. In a letter, crystal clear, May 24th, 2016, they were the ones to tell coal that they could strip mine in the Rocky Mountains.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Pagan has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Minister of Infrastructure announced they would be doubling the budget for capital maintenance and renewal for 2020-21. This would mean going from $937 million to $1.9 billion by accelerating its capital plan. This was to give the ability for construction companies in Alberta to keep their workers during the pandemic. To the Minister of Infrastructure, did this increase in budget benefit Albertans working in the construction industry through last season in the way intended? And will it keep them working during this season despite the pandemic?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is right. With the onset of the pandemic, we decided to double the capital maintenance and renewal budget because we need people working right away. These projects might include replacing leaky windows on a school or replacing a boiler in a provincial building. It's not going to be front page news, but it is important work. It's putting food on tables across Alberta. It extends the life of provincial buildings, which was one of the recommendations of the McKinnon panel.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Pagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his answer. Given that the decision to double this amount was a significant increase in the capital maintenance budget, and given that throughout the province there are projects that are shovel-ready but need additional funding from our government to proceed, to the same minister, how did this government decide on what projects were shovel-ready and what could wait to be completed until later in the year?
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you for that good question. Across government, we work hard to objectively measure what projects are most critical. We take politics out of the process and ensure that most critical projects are given priority. The list of capital maintenance and renewal projects is long, but it is creating jobs in every corner of the province. We are continuing to fund capital maintenance and renewal at record levels, and I look forward to joining the Minister of Transportation tomorrow to highlight this year's capital plan commitments to the CMR.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again to the Minister for his answer. Given that the long-term capital maintenance and renewal strategy ensures that capital assets are sustained and repaired, and given that long-term commitment included schools, roads, secondary institutions, and justice facilities, to the Minister, why is it important to continue our government's commitment to putting extra funding into projects such as these, instead of placing the additional funding into other recovery plan options?
The Minister.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the member, not only we are funding CMR with provincial dollars, but the small amount of remaining money in the ICIP program is being used for the capital maintenance and renewal. Through this COVID-19 stream, the federal government pays 80% of the cost of these projects, while Alberta government only pays 20%. When too many people are out of work, this is a great way to get Albertans back to work and to take advantage of some federal dollars at the same time, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly Clairview.
It's been a month since the Premier announced the new enhanced COVID-19 business benefit. Let's be clear, this announcement was nothing more than to use Alberta small businesses to gain some good press by announcing an unfinished grant that wouldn't be available for more than 6 more weeks. We're now 3 weeks away from when the benefit will become available, and we still do not know the details on how a small business will qualify. To the Minister, small businesses have continually asked for transparency and clarity so that they'll have the ability to plan ahead. Why haven't you released the details of this benefit, and when will you?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to acknowledge the significant hardship that so many small businesses in Alberta have experienced since the onset of the pandemic a year ago. And Mr. Speaker, that's why we supported small businesses in a very significant way, starting with a workers' compensation board deferral and a premium abatement for small and medium-sized enterprises. That's why we've come forward with well over $500 million in direct supports for small businesses that have been affected by public health measures. Mr. Speaker, our Minister of Jobs, the Economy and Innovation continues to listen to small businesses.
Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly Clairview.
It's time to act. Businesses are waiting. Given that I stood with small business owners earlier today that are struggling to make ends meet and that openly questioned why this government is dragging its feet, well, they can hardly keep their doors open. Given that the new benefit requires businesses to report all the supports they've received to ensure that no more than 80% of the revenue is covered, but yet this government still has not released how that will be calculated. Given that these businesses have desperately been accessing every dollar in support to pay their bills and they're still drowning in debt, to the Minister, these businesses have racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. How will you ensure they do not get...
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, this government and certainly the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation is working with small business leaders to ensure that there's a strong recovery plan in place as we move from pandemic to economic recovery. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister will also be rolling out additional details regarding the latest form of small business supports for those businesses that remain severely affected by the pandemic and public health measures.
member.
Minister, you still haven't answered when. Given that this new benefit is supposed to target the worst hit businesses, but is only offering 15% of 1 month's revenue, given that Samuel, owner of Ocean River Cruise, recorded a loss of over 90% of last year's revenue, Chris, owner of Dickens Live Music Venues, not operated for 10 out of the last 12 months. Both of these owners represent struggles the rest of the sector is facing. Minister, you have all of the information in front of you. From what sectors have been hit the hardest, most impacted by public health orders, and which will continue to be the most impacted. Why are you not using this information to create sector-specific support?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation will be very shortly rolling out additional details with the most recent grant support for small businesses. But, Mr. Speaker, this government has supported small businesses in a more significant way financially than our comparator provinces. Moreover, we're focused on economic recovery, on providing opportunity for small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses in this province to recover, to grow, to create tens of thousands of jobs, Mr. Speaker, and expand our fiscal capacity in the province.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud has a question.
A slight increase. That's how the Minister of Children's Services described the deeply troubling rise in deaths of former kids in government care this morning. Mr. Speaker, 14 young people over the age of 18 who received supports have died this year. Last year it was 10, the year before 7. There have been years where it was only 2, and this year is not over yet. These are young Albertans, they're dying. Minister, are you really going to try to diminish this problem by describing it as a slight increase?
The Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, what I said this morning in estimates is that the death of any child who is or has been in care is a tragedy, as is the death of any child or youth in our province. Mr. Speaker, we take this subject very seriously. This is something that all of my colleagues take very seriously. And as I said this morning, we look at all of the data. This is something that I reached out to the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate about to ask for his thoughts on and his office's support on, so that we can continue to look at every single case to determine if we need to do better, make sure policies are followed, and change policies if they need to be changed.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud.
Given that under this minister's watch, the number of Indigenous children in care who have died is the highest in a decade, and given that the minister told me this morning she has now reversed course on a cruel decision to lower the age of eligibility for supports for former kids in care for this year at least, Minister, will you admit now that you made a mistake in cutting the SAFA program, and the reasons to keep supporting these young people this year will be the same reasons to continue to support them in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, what we know is that the Supports and Financial Assistance Agreement program proposed is similar to those across the country. We have to continue to support young adults right now. This isn't a new decision or a change in course. We've said all along throughout this pandemic that we're going to make sure young adults transitioning out of child intervention and into adulthood have the supports they need at this uncertain time, both due to the pandemic and the uncertainty in the economy.
Member.
Given that these young people will continue to need these supports long into the future, and given that the minister has restored supports for former kids in care for this year only, but given that this government continually goes back on promises and looks to save money on the backs of the most vulnerable Albertans so they can continue with their failed economic experiments, Minister, will you commit that you will never again cut supports from former kids in government care? Albertans are looking for a long-term commitment for you to do the right thing.
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell this House is that we have increased funding to child intervention. We have budgeted for caseload growth, unlike the members opposite who, after an all-party panel on child intervention, left child intervention unfunded. We covered that backlog in funding. We accounted for those case counts, and we will continue to make sure that our obligation to support kids and families in need in Alberta, in the greatest need in Alberta, will continue to be supported.
The Honourable Member for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I didn't plan it this way, but it fits very well my question with the ministerial statement. This last fall, I was appointed chair of the Northern Alberta Development Council. As part of this position, I've had meetings with the Northern Alberta elected leaders. Since first meeting with them, I've received many calls and letters voicing unanimous concern for the high vacancy and turnover rate for medical jobs in rural Alberta. To the Minister of Health, What steps are you taking now to ensure there is an adequate amount of quality medical professionals in rural Alberta that will be there for the long term, including on our First Nations?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And undersupply in rural and remote areas is a long-standing problem, and we are taking action to fix it. We're working with med schools. It starts with that because effective recruitment starts in getting young people from rural Alberta into medical school and exposing med students and residents to rural practice. We're also continuing to implement the Rural Health Workforce Action Plan as announced last April, which included the members' input, and I thank him for that hard work that he did. And it includes also working with communities because they know what their needs are the best and how to meet them. And we're committed to working with physicians to try new approaches to match physicians with communities that need them the most.
The honourable member for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister. In 2019-2020, 99 rural Albertans applied to the U of A medical program. 95 were interviewed, and only 23 were admitted. Given that there is a small amount of rural Albertans admitted that are well qualified for medical school, and given that rural Alberta has low medical employment and high turnover rates, to the Minister of Advanced Education, what is the government doing to ensure that there are equal opportunities for rural Albertans to enroll in Alberta's medical schools to keep homegrown medical professionals in our communities that will stay in our communities?
Honourable the Minister of Children's Services has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that is an excellent question. We know all Albertans need to have equal opportunity to education and that we need to keep it accessible to all potential students. Through Alberta 2030, the Skills for Jobs strategy will be looking at ways to facilitate more collaboration between post-secondary institutions so students have opportunity to access certain programs like these. Collaborative degree programs, Mr. Speaker, have been used successfully in several areas, including medical fields. For instance, Grand Prairie Regional College offers a collaborative baccalaureate nursing program, which allows students to complete all courses of their degree at GPRC. We hope to expand on opportunities such of this kind to support our students across the province.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Minister. Definitely a step in the right direction. Given that the Health Minister announced last April mandatory spots set aside for rural Albertans applying for med school within Alberta, and given that this initiative is designed to ensure adequate representation for rural communities in our medical schools and in the healthcare system, and given that having rural Alberta students return to their communities benefits local patients and their communities, to the Minister of Advanced Education, how does attracting more rural Alberta students to our medical schools address the vacancies and high turnover rate of medical professionals that we experience in rural Alberta?
The honourable minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In all fields, we see students want to settle down and establish careers where they grew up, but are often kept from doing so because they leave the area to attend post-secondary and don't often move back. Through increasing collaboration between our institutions, we can create more opportunities for students to stay in their communities while receiving a high-quality education, or, Mr. Speaker, put incentives in place for these students to return to their communities after their studies are complete.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Yesterday was one of the strangest press conferences I've ever seen. The Minister of Infrastructure and Education standing in a construction zone, not announcing much construction, definitely nothing for the families of Edmonton Public or Calgary Public or Calgary Catholic. The public schools here in Evanston, for example, a new middle school is desperately needed, but the infrastructure minister didn't have any announcements for them. So can he answer this place why the members of Calgary North and Calgary Foothills failed to stand up for their constituents and get them this desperately needed middle school?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
So, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, in Calgary, there are so many other schools under construction right now. Evanston, North Calgary, Auburn Bay Elementary, Auburn Bay Middle, and Cochrane Elementary. So, and yesterday's announcement, in fact, the board chair of Catholic Board of Edmonton joined us in celebrating that announcement. So, there is a lot of work to be done, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister of Education and I are working together.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Given that the question was about families in Evanston represented by Conservative MLAs, and given that another group of Albertans, led down by the Education Minister, are the families here in Edmonton, they need a replacement school for Delton. But given that the families of Calgary Public and the families of Calgary Edmonton Public were shut out of announcements for infrastructure that's desperately needed for their children, can the minister, any minister over there, explain why he thinks Edmontonians are upset with this UCP government? Because it's pretty easy to see that this UCP government doesn't care about Edmontonians.
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
What UCP government cares, Mr. Speaker, is to unite the people, not divide the people based on the electoral prospectus like NDP does. So, Mr. Speaker, there are lots of schools under construction in Edmonton. I can read out the list. The 35 seconds are not enough, but I'll provide you the list.
Member.
And given that the Minister of Education tried to pull a fast one on the families of Calgary yesterday, putting Calgary Board of Education in the announcement, but the truth is that all that's being announced is ownership options to move Montgomery School to another owner, can the minister explain how transferring title for a school is worthy of a hard hat construction announcement when there were no new school spaces in that announcement for Calgary Public, Calgary Catholic families in the City of Calgary, Edmonton Public families in the City of Edmonton, or any families in Edmonton south of the river? Like, this budget does not reflect the needs of our schools, of our students, or of...
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, what we hear from the opposition are constant lines of politicization around capital spending priorities. Mr. Speaker, that's the way they made decisions when they governed, but that's not the way this government makes decisions. Mr. Speaker, we prioritize based on need. We have projects from one corner of this province to the other. We're investing $20.7 billion in our 3-year capital plan to put tens of thousands of Albertans to work and create necessary core infrastructure.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
What an opportunity this government had to act on housing and homelessness. But instead of being leaders, they made drastic cuts, slashing 22% of funding for houseless folks. The evidence is clear. Supportive housing works. We've seen movement on this from municipalities and from the federal government, yet nothing from the province. The City of Edmonton had a small ask in this budget, and the UCP denied it. Supportive housing not only saves money, but it saves lives too. If the moral argument won't work for you, then what about the economic one? Why do you refuse to invest in supportive housing?
Hey. The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, specifically when we speak about housing and homelessness, I am pleased to rise today on behalf of both of my colleagues, the Minister of Community and Social Services and the Minister of Seniors and Housing. First, I'll address the questions around homelessness, which Alberta's government has provided $73 million to homeless shelters and community organizations to protect people struggling with homelessness during the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to ensure 24/7 access to critical services such as day sleep, showers, laundry, meal service, connection to housing, and medical supports, along with isolation and care. Mr. Speaker, service providers continue to use this funding to support Albertans experiencing homelessness, and I'm sure I'll be able to talk about housing in the next.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands, Norwood.
Workers in shelters for the unhoused have done an incredible job in a very trying time, and we want to express our appreciation for the work that they do. Sadly, we've heard some troubling stories from folks accessing shelters, including experiences of homophobia and of proselytization. On top of that, there's a need for 24/7 access and basic dignity, like cots instead of mats. Folks who are houseless deserve humane treatment and respect, not judgment for who they are or who they love. Is the government aware of these concerns? We know that the City of Edmonton has engaged with you on shelter standards. Will you commit to addressing them? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Member for Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, Budget 2021 does maintain funding for homeless shelters at nearly $49 million, ensuring those who require emergency shelters have a safe place to stay. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am not aware of the specific concerns the member opposite has raised, but I'm sure if she would like to bring them to me or to the Minister of Community and Social Services, I'm sure the Minister would be happy to look into those concerns.
The Honourable Member.
Albertans were shocked and saddened to see the treatment of houseless folks over the last few months, with examples of unhoused folks being pushed out of the cold and experiencing poor treatment from police as well. This cannot just be an issue when the weather is cold. We need to be advocating for houseless folks all year round. And it's clear that one of the most effective ways to support folks experiencing homelessness is by investing in people. And we know that many folks who are unhoused struggle with addictions and mental health concerns. This government has made it clear that they've got no interest in investing in housing. So how can you also justify refusing to invest in harm reduction and mental health supports?
The Honourable Minister.
very much, Mr. Speaker. The Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions has committed to invest in 4,000 treatment beds to support those who are struggling with mental health and addictions and in needs of supports. We got to make sure that these supports are there because we know that this is very important to treat some of the or support folks in some of the underlying causes that may, as the member opposite said, result in homelessness.
Honourable member for Calgary-Klein has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Budget 2021 and 2022 gives another double-digit deficit, with debt projected to go over $100 billion. I don't think that makes any of us feel very good. I understand we can't cut our way out of a pandemic and a global recession. However, I want to understand what we are doing today to ensure that we're going to be on a path back to balance tomorrow. To the Minister of Finance, what actions are we taking today to set the foundation for balance tomorrow?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. Budget 2021 had 3 priorities: ensuring that we were resourcing health to adequately deal with the pandemic, positioning the province for economic growth and recovery, and it also ensures continued fiscal responsibility by keeping our net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, by, over the course of this fiscal plan, aligning our per capita spend to be at least as efficient as other provinces, and also a commitment to Albertans that when we're past the pandemic, have economic clarity, that we will provide a path and timeline to balance.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his diligent work. Given that the McKinnon panel review provided numerous recommendations on how to get our spending in line with comparable provinces, and given Alberta can no longer afford to be an outlier when it comes to spending, can the Minister share where we're at in regards to the implementation of these recommendations and how that is highlighted in this budget?
The Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the most shocking conclusions that Dr. Janice McKinnon and her panel found was that in Alberta in 2019, we were spending over $10 billion more than comparator provinces delivering government services. And Mr. Speaker, that fact informed our fiscal anchor to bring our per capita spending in terms of delivering government services to align with other provinces. I'm pleased, Mr. Speaker, that Budget 2021 keeps us on that path. We will accomplish that goal in this fiscal plan.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the Minister for his diligent work. Given with an $18.2 billion deficit, and given even if we were not in a pandemic and an economic downturn, we would not be able to balance this budget on cuts alone, at least not without creating chaos. And given we have to increase revenues, I'm hoping that the Minister could talk a little bit more about how we're creating more reliable revenue sources.
The Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are creating additional revenues for the Government of Alberta by focusing on economic recovery and growth. Mr. Speaker, that's why it was already last June when the Premier and I rolled out the initial framework for the Economic Recovery Plan, a plan that is being built out every week, every month since by ministers across government. Mr. Speaker, we are positioning the province for disproportionate investment attraction, which will create tens of thousands of jobs, increased fiscal capacity, and increased revenues for the Government of Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, it was reported that Red Cross is supporting the Drumheller Institution in managing a massive COVID-19 outbreak. The facility has already seen 83 cases of the virus, 63 among inmates and 20 staff. This is a very serious situation, risking the lives of inmates and the staff. To the Minister of Justice, have you been in touch with your federal counterparts, and what action specifically are you taking to contain the spread in this facility?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to answer on behalf of my colleague, and I will find out whether he's spoken to the federal counterparts, but I know that Dr. Hinch and our office are in constant contact, as well as the MOHs in the zone, in the South Zone, being able to help with and support the work that's being done in correctional facilities throughout the province, in particular with that outbreak, so that the resources are there in place to make sure that any outbreak, including the one there that the member mentions, is being managed from being able to continue with the spread through the facility.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Given that it's not the first time we are seeing outbreaks in Alberta, in the Calgary Correctional Centre, we saw an outbreak out of control that infected 400 inmates and staff. Staff reported to us that they were still being forced to work at the facility after testing positive for the COVID-19. And given that there was widespread fear about the virus spreading from the facility into the broader community, Minister, can you assure Albertans, particularly those in Drumheller, that steps are being taken to prevent COVID-19 spread in their community?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The safety and security and health of staff and inmates remains a priority at all of Alberta's correction facilities. Many COVID-19 infectious disease protocols and safeguards were put in place in early March 2020. They remain in place in partnership with Alberta Health Services. Each facility is monitored individually, and further steps are warranted. Additional infection preventions and controls measures are instituted in consultation with AHS. These proactive measures help prevent the spread of COVID-19 in our facilities in many months, and I will talk more specifically about those steps in the next supplemental.
The Honourable Member.
Given that the Drumheller outbreak shows how much of a risk the correctional system is for the spread of COVID-19, and that it takes great care to protect staff and inmates, and given that the Minister has cut correctional facilities in this budget, and given that in estimates last night, the Minister couldn't point to any concrete action he is taking to support correctional facilities. Minister, will you finally step up, do the right thing, and provide additional funding and resources to correctional facilities to manage these outbreaks?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Precautionary measures and procedures put in place to prevent COVID-19 from entering and spreading in facilities include, on arrival, all new admissions continue to be tested, separately quarantining new inmates for up to 14 days on arrival, and separate medical isolation units for positive inmates where possible, Mr. Speaker. And as the Minister of Health has said, the Minister of Justice, the Ministry of Justice continues to work with Alberta Health Services to protect our prison system, Mr. Speaker, through concrete measures, Mr. Speaker. And again, this is not a political issue. This is about protecting lives, Mr. Speaker, and it's unfortunate the NDP continue to try to play politics with such an important issue.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert has a question.
We've learned hard lessons about who's most at risk for serious and deadly outcomes related to COVID. People with developmental disabilities frequently have underlying health conditions and risks associated with communal living, reliance on staff, and challenges following public health orders. While the government reports on outbreaks and deaths in some communal settings, it does not report infections, hospitalizations, and death of Albertans supported by the Department of Persons with Developmental Disabilities. Minister, why hasn't your government provided any public data related to COVID about Albertans with developmental disabilities funded by PDD?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, I'm happy to take that feedback to Dr. Hinshaw and to ask if that is something that she can disclose through the alberta.ca website, Mr. Speaker. We are obviously tracking a bunch of different data points that for Albertans to be able to see in the reporting. We continue to be leaders in the transparency and what's reported to Albertans throughout the pandemic. I'm happy to get that feedback to Dr. Hinshaw for her to consider.
For St. Albert.
Given during the period of March to September 2019, caseloads grew by 202 people, but during the same period in 2020, caseloads decreased by 146 people, while the wait list stagnated at over 2,000 people. Given this government has not reported any caseload data for the last 6 months, I'm left with questions. Minister, what is the total number of Albertans funded by PDD who are infected by COVID, hospitalized, and how many Albertans with developmental disabilities have died as a result?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We understand how important these services are for individuals receiving services, their families and caretakers when we are talking about PDT supports. We have heard the Minister has consulted with families and guardians about the current services that they are receiving. The Minister has listened to and heard this feedback, and as for those specific numbers, I am happy to follow up on that at a later time.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Given that I would appreciate data being tabled with this chamber here, given the fact that prioritization of vaccine distribution is based on risk factors and deaths, and given the fact that we know Albertans with developmental disabilities are far more at risk of death and increased support needs if they survive infection and are forced to deal with the realities of long COVID, what data was used to justify the exclusion of Albertans with developmental disabilities?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was the work that physicians throughout the country have in doing, both in the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, the NACI, NACI, as well as our own provincial advisory committee on vaccinations that is headed by Dr. Henshaw, for them to be able to look at that information and be able to come with the recommendations to us on who should be included and what underlying conditions of patients throughout the province would be considered to be included in phase 2B, which would be the inclusion of folks 18 to 64 who would be included in the vaccination rollout program, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Central Peace Notley.
When family doctors, specialists, and other medical professionals start their careers, they don't just consider what's best for them, but what's best for their family. Where their career leads them is where their family will also work, play, and grow up. In rural Alberta, it's helpful that we have incentives, in addition, of course, to being the best place to work, play, and raise a family, to attract doctors to fulfill our healthcare needs. CRT licenses, where doctors have their pay adjusted depending on where they are sent, are but one tool used to attract medical professionals. To the Minister, what other ways is your ministry ensuring that working as a doctor in rural regions such as the Peace Country are attractive options for young upcoming health professionals?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for throughout 2020 and before that, and being able to work with our office to help us develop the action plan that we announced last April which included a number of things, including increasing the compensation for physicians who work in rural communities, making compensation in rural Alberta among the highest for rural physicians in Canada. We also have a long-established group of primary care networks that provide supports for family practitioners and their patients. We do have a single health authority as well, which helps us in being able to recruit to our rural communities. And again, thank you to the honourable member for his assistance on this.
The honourable member, Central Peace.
Given that I've said before in the House that it makes better sense to bring 20 people to one specialist when it's better to bring one specialist to 20 people, and given that not only does this ensure that proper facilities and care are available for rural patients, but it also draws pressure from centralized medical hotspots and urban centres, to the Minister, what is your ministry doing to ensure availability and ease of access to surgeries and specialized treatment for rural Alberta?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Rural Remote Northern program is now the most generous of its kind in the country, now that we have taken off the cap of the variable fee. And as well, smaller hospitals are integral in our strategy to maintain access to surgeries in spite of the pandemic, and they'll be an integral part of the Alberta Surgical Initiative that's going forward. As well, AHS and Covenant have been maximizing surgery volumes with extended hours at 5 sites. That's in Edson, Innisfail, Peace River, and Banff, as well as the Royal Alex in Edmonton, Mr. Speaker. And thank you very much.
Given that as a shortage of doctors and specialists in rural Alberta has been a problem for decades, and given that I appreciate the Minister of Health's endeavours to alleviate this issue, and given that when we retain these professionals and their families in our communities, it benefits community as a whole by further growing and supporting services and employment opportunities and the economy, to the Minister, how are you and your ministry encouraging the retention of medical professionals in rural Alberta?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And government funds a variety of programs to address the recruitment and retention of physicians in rural and remote communities. In fact, Alberta has one of the best incentive programs for rural physicians in Canada to make sure that we have rural physicians who are supported financially to remain where they are. And the Rural Remote Northern program that I mentioned provides direct financial incentives to physicians who live in and practice in underserved communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As an alumni and someone who has worked alongside many graduates from our province's post-secondary institutions, I can say that our advanced education system produces smart, educated, and driven grads who bring that drive to the workplace. They consistently match with their peers across Canada. Where we do not match with our peers across Canada is cost. We consistently spend more per capita on education with no visible change in outcomes. To the Minister, while being mindful of our fiscal anchors, how are you ensuring that our institutions will continue to be able to perform with excellence?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services to answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Alberta has historically had the highest taxpayer-funded post-secondary system in the country, and Albertans can't afford to pay such a high amount of per-student funding compared to other provinces. However, Mr. Speaker, we are committed to ensuring that our institutions continue to offer world-class education to all of our students. Budget 2021 includes nearly $2 billion for our institutions through the Operating and Program Support Grant. Mr. Speaker, we've directed our post-secondary institutions to prioritize reductions to administrative costs, and they're doing a great job at achieving that. The president of the U of A said yesterday they have reduced admin costs by $95 million.
The member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given I've heard from my constituents that that our educational institutions need to prepare students for the workplace, and given businesses are of like mind on this, wanting sharp, eager graduates who know their business and contribute to their growth. To the Minister, what are you doing to ensure that graduates have the knowledge and skills that they will need to succeed, and that they enter into the marketplace with the jobs that they excel at and in turn grow the Alberta economy?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That question that the member has asked is exactly what we're doing through Alberta 2030, Building Skills for Jobs strategy. Alberta 2030 will help strengthen skills for jobs and ensure that our students graduate with the knowledge and competencies that they need to succeed in whatever career they pursue, whether that's in the arts, skilled trades, or STEM. Mr. Speaker, a number of initiatives included will offer more opportunities for students to participate in work-integrated learning and the expansion of apprenticeship education. We've committed $15 million for My Tax, $10 million for Women Building Futures, and over $6 million for careers to create more internship and apprenticeship opportunities.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given that our universities, trade colleges, and other advanced education providers need adequate funding, to the Minister, how are you working with these institutions to ensure that their funding goes where it needs to for the future success of Alberta grads and our economy?
The Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. The member is again correct. Adequate funding is essential for post-secondary institutions to offer quality services and supports to students, which is why we invest nearly $2 billion through the Operating and Program Support Grant. To achieve this, we'll be implementing performance-based funding for the coming academic year, which will tie a portion of an institution's funding to particular outcomes. These funding metrics, Mr. Speaker, would directly relate to students having opportunities to gain skills and experiences that will help them succeed in the labor force.
Honourable Member, this concludes the time allotted for oral question period. In 30 seconds or less, we will return to member statements. Member for Saskatchewan-Vegreville.
Mr. Speaker, like my colleagues, I've been elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly for almost 2 years. During this time, there have been ups and downs, but today I would like to speak on one of my proudest moments as an MLA. Almost 2 years ago, I introduced my private member's bill, Bill 201, the Protection of Students with Life-Threatening Allergies Act. This bill is near and dear to my heart, as I've also lived with life-threatening food allergies. I've nearly lost a child during an allergic reaction, which led to an anaphylactic shock. Bill 201 requires that all schools in Alberta have epinephrine auto-injectors on hand, and that the staff operating in schools are properly trained in both recognizing and reacting to severe allergic reactions. I was thankful to have the support from various organizations across the province, the country, and internationally. I'm proud of the progress that it has made since it took effect last year. The auto-injectors have been rolled out in every school in the province, which is about 2,500 schools. The bill has made it safer for the students and the teachers and staff to know that they have an EpiPen available when needed. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all those who were involved in making the bill possible, as well as the rollout of auto-injectors and training. I would like to thank the school boards, educators for taking the time and energy to get trained in allergy awareness and auto-injector administration. I would like to thank Alberta Health Services and pharmacists who were able to provide the necessary training and auto-injectors to schools and staff. I would also like to express my gratitude to all the MLAs in this Assembly who gave unanimous consent and passed Bill 201. Together, we have saved lives. Remember, blue to the sky, orange to the thigh. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Mountain View.
The Premier of Alberta bet over $7 billion of Albertans' money on Donald Trump winning the American election. A few short years ago, we would have considered that statement ludicrous, laughable even, but now it's true. When the bet was made in March of 2020, it was clear that there were significant risks. Legal risks from a foreign regulatory process, political risks from a foreign election. None of these risks were in the control of Canadians or Canadian governments. But the Premier made a risky $7.5 billion bet anyway, with our money. The UCP just loved to say that the bet was the only way, but the truth is the NDP government was able to support the project. We supported it by making a commitment of barrels of oil, not other people's money. To add insult to injury, the UCP won't even tell us how much money they lost. First, it was $1 billion in the equity investment. Then the Premier claimed he was speaking in American dollars and it was $1.5 billion. Now we have a mystery page in the budget showing almost $900 million in loan guarantee has been spent. In addition to the 1.5, it's not clear. But still, no details from the government on how the loan guarantee can be used, who makes the decisions on spending or stopping, how much will be spent, or what we may still be on the hook for. And Mr. Speaker, nothing booked in the budget. Despite getting a reprimand for failing to book $100 million in budget last year, despite their own claim that the equity investment of $1.5 billion was being spent in 2020, nothing booked. Not past, not present. Mr. Speaker, this is our money. We deserve to know how it's being spent. But the UCP government seems to think they can gamble with Albertans' money, hide the details from us, and have no repercussions. I'm not sure Albertans are going to agree.
The honourable member for Calgary North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. John G. Diefenbaker, the 13th Prime Minister of Canada, stated, and I quote, "I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think is right, freedom to suppose what I believe wrong, or free to choose those who shall govern my country. The heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind," unquote. Madam Speaker, we are incredibly lucky to be living in a country which provides freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and freedom of religion under the Charter of Rights. However, as we hear from time to time, our society is still plagued with acts of racism, hatred, and discrimination. The recent hate-motivated attacks that took place in Edmonton in December 2020 and February 2021 is unacceptable, and I fiercely condemn it. I want my fellow Albertans to know that I stand with them, I'm here to support them, and I will continue to fight against discrimination in this province and beyond. Recently, the Parliament of Canada passed a motion that recognizes a campaign of genocide against Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims. Madam Speaker, this motion is an important reminder that there are people still fighting every day for their basic rights to be respected. The simple fact is that when humanity's values are disregarded, we are all at risk. Every human deserves to be treated fairly and equally. And although here in Canada we support this statement, there are many nations that do not. As a global community, we have moved forward on human rights for all, and we must support those who continue to fight for their basic human rights. I urge everyone to join me in advocating for basic human rights, including freedom of movement, security, livelihoods, speech, religion, and the right to peacefully protest in Canada and abroad. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Highwood.
Mr. Speaker, for hundreds of thousands of Albertans, the small and medium-sized oil and gas industry is essential to the sustainability of their lives and their communities. Our small and medium oil and gas companies represent over 90% of all oil and gas employment. Whether it is a rig worker, crane operator, accountant, geologist, or someone working in a corporate office, these companies are the lifeblood of innovation and opportunity. It is essential that we recognize how small and medium oil and gas producers will be essential to Alberta's economic recovery. Despite these producers not being the mainstream operations in oil and gas production, you cannot deny that they are key players in the path to recovery for our entire country. We should also acknowledge that these operators are more than just simple employers and contributors to our government revenue. Small to medium-sized oil and gas producers are important economic drivers in small communities. They are supporters of our urban and rural youth sports and local community charities. The impacts of the last 5 years, the Saudi-Russia oil price war and ongoing punishing federal legislation have severely put their sustainability in jeopardy. The involvement that these producers have in their pursuit to take their operations to the next level helps keep the economy strong while supplying new employment for so many. These oil and gas producers need a clear path to grow in this ever-developing economic realm in Canada. The oil and gas industry is one of Canada's largest employers, supporting more than 500,000 jobs in every province and territory and 3 million Canadians overall. Natural gas and oil companies contribute an average of $8 billion in taxes that goes to schools, hospitals, and all of our social programs. With world-class natural resources and with oil and gas standing as Canada's #1 export commodity, a strong oil and gas sector is key to driving our jobs recovery. And we are fortunate to have so many innovative small and medium oil and gas operators in our province.
The honourable member for West Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with many of my colleagues on this side of the Assembly, I have stood up confidently in opposition to the Liberal government's attack on law-abiding firearms owners. This opposition began when Trudeau's Liberals introduced an order in Council to ban over 1,500 firearms that were categorized as assault style. However, the firearms banned are not assault style, and that type of language serves to only misinform the uninformed. While this order in Council was a direct attack on law-abiding firearms owners, the Liberals would not stop there. Recently, the Federal Minister of Public Safety introduced another controversial bill that again seeks to demonize law-abiding firearms owners. Bill C-21 would allow the government to withhold gun licenses for extremely vague reasons, while also giving municipalities across Canada the power to ban a number of handguns. This bill is wrong for many reasons, but the main reason is because it does not address the issue of gun violence at all. As many have noted, automatic weapons have long been prohibited in Canada. Handguns have also been heavily restricted for many decades. They must be stored at home in locked containers and can only be fired at shooting ranges. The Conservatives tried to address gun violence through a private member's bill that would have increased criminal sentences for those smuggling illegal firearms. Yet, the Liberals got together with their NDP buddies to ensure it did not pass. And instead of addressing gun violence, the Liberals repealed a bunch of mandatory minimum sentences for offences committed with firearms. Once again, Trudeau's Liberals have decided that those who follow the law are more dangerous than criminals. Even Canadians who own airsoft or paintball guns are more threatening than criminals for the Liberals. I will continue to speak out against this attack on law-abiding firearms owners in my constituency. When will Prime Minister Trudeau and his Liberal government, along with their NDP allies, realize that we ought to respect those that follow the law, rather than hold them in contempt? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rise to referring to Standing Order 7-8 to notify the House that routine can continue past 3 o'clock p.m.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika.
Why, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Private Bills and Private Members' Public Bills, I am pleased to table the committee's final report on Bill 208, Alberta Investment Management Corporation Amendment Act 2020, sponsored by the member for Lethbridge West. This bill was referred to the committee, I believe, on December 7th, 2020. Mr. Speaker, the report recommends that Bill 208 not proceed. I request concurrence of the Assembly in the final report on Bill 208. And I have another tabling. Do I do that now or after the...
You don't. Honourable members, the motion for concurrence in the report on Bill 208, Alberta Investment Management Corporation Amendment Act 2020, is debatable pursuant to Standing Order 18.1b. Are there any members who wish to speak to the motion for concurrence? Seeing a member, a motion for concurrence will proceed at the earliest convenience, or at the earliest opportunity, which is next Monday. The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika, I believe, on Bill 209.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I rise as Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Private Bills, Private Members, Public Bills, and I'm pleased to table the committee's final report on Bill 209, Cost of Public Service Transparency Act, sponsored by the member for Red Deer South. The bill was referred to the committee on December 7th. Mr. Speaker, the report recommends the Bill 209 proceed. I request concurrence of the Assembly on the final report of Bill 209.
Honourable members, the motion for concurrence in the report on Bill 209, Cost of Public Service Transparency Act, is debatable pursuant to Standing Order 18.1b. Are there any members wishing to speak to the motion for concurrence? Seeing none, the chair of the Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Private Bills, Private Bills, has requested concurrence on the report of Bill 209, Cost of Public Service Transparency Act. Does the Assembly agree in the report? If so, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Presenting petitions, notices of motions, introduction of bills.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Municipal Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I request leave to introduce Bill 656, the Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021. If passed, this bill will amend the Local Government Fiscal Framework Act to help ensure infrastructure funding for municipalities aligns with the fiscal realities of our province as set out in Budget 2021. Mr. Speaker, this bill also amends the Emergency 911 Act. If passed, this bill will strengthen Alberta's 911 system and prepare our province for necessary 911 upgrades. Together, the changes made by the Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021 will protect lives and livelihoods by modernizing our 911 system so Albertans can continue to have safe and reliable 911 services, including by using text, and by supporting the job-creating capital projects of municipalities right across Alberta. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, members, the Minister of Transportation and Municipal Affairs has moved first reading of Bill 56, Local Measured Statutes Amendment Act 2020. Those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021 is now read a first time.
Well, the Minister of Indigenous Relations has an introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I request leave today to introduce Bill 57, the Métis Settlements Amendment Act 2021. Throughout the past year, I have traveled to several Métis settlements and have been discussing modernizing the Métis Settlement Act. In 1990, legislators in Alberta passed an act to incorporate 1.25 million acres of land for Métis people into the 8 Métis settlements, the cultural homelands for what is now more than 5,600 people. 30 years later, I've heard it's time to modernize that act to better meet the wishes of the settlement residents for more sustainable and self-governing communities, with more transparent finances and government administration and less involvement from Alberta's government. It is with great respect for Métis culture and history and the importance of the Métis settlement's land base that I propose the legislative amendments and move first reading of Bill 57, the Métis Settlement Amendment Act 2021.
Honourable members, the Minister of Indigenous Relations has moved first reading of Bill 57, Métis Settlement Amendment Act 2021. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. My opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 57, Métis Settlements Amendment Act 2021 is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, during the QP, the leader of opposition and the education critic was talking about the number of schools in Edmonton. I have a dozen schools just in Edmonton, not the suburbs. And since there is none in this list for Old Stittsbury, I suspect you won't let me read the list, so I leave. So I have requisite copies and I'll table them.
Even if there was one, I wouldn't let you read the list, the Honourable Minister. Are there others? Seeing none.
Tablings to the clerk, deferred divisions.
Members, points of order. And at 2:02, the Government House Leader raised a point of order.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do rise on a point of order. I am going to refer to House of Commons Procedures and Practices, Mr. Speaker. I'm working off the third edition, page 217, in regards to attendance. And I quote, "The Speaker has traditionally discouraged members from signaling the absence of another member from the House because there are many places that members have to be in order to carry out all the obligations that go with the office," Mr. Speaker. The point of order that I am referring to, Mr. Speaker, happened at the time that I raised it inside the chamber. I have access to my transcript. It, of course, is not the blues, Mr. Speaker, but I'm not aware if you have the blues yet, I should say, Mr. Speaker. But I will say what my transcript says, and that's the honourable member from Edmonton Gold Bar referencing the Premier. He says, "Albertans want answers from the Premier, but apparently he has executive time scheduled today, Mr. Speaker." There are many orders in this House, not only in House of Commons Procedures and Practices, but from yourself and from many who have held the role that you've had inside this House, Mr. Speaker, making clear that we should not refer to absences of members inside this chamber. Mr. Speaker, as the Premier's absence was referred to, I feel obligated today to make clear that he is with a Council of Federations meeting with all the premiers across the province or across the country, Mr. Speaker, standing up for our province, which is probably why we're on track to have the largest economic recovery in the country, Mr. Speaker. We're proud of the Premier and the hard work that he is doing. But with that said, we should not be getting into the habit of referring to absences from this House, Mr. Speaker, and I would encourage the opposition not to start that, because I would be happy to refer to every time that the Leader of the official opposition is absent, if that's how they would like to play it.
The Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Certainly in this case, referencing executive time, something that came up at the estimates debate yesterday, was not appropriate. On behalf of the member, I apologize and withdraw that comment.
Consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Orders of the day, orders du jour.
Message from Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor.
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I've received a message from Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor, which I now transmit to you. Order. All right.
The Lieutenant Governor transmits supplementary supply estimates of certain sums required for the service of the province for the fiscal year March 31, 2021, and recommends the same to the Assembly. Please be seated. The Honourable the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I now wish to table the 2020-2021 supplementary supply estimates number 2. Budget 2021 includes the updated fiscal outlook for 2020-2021 and a related framework for additional necessary spending by the government. My statement in the estimates affirms that the province's fiscal situation has not materially changed since the budget was tabled a short time ago. This constitutes the fiscal plan update required by the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act in relation to the tabling of the supplementary estimates. Mr. Speaker, these supplementary supply estimates will provide additional spending to 7 government departments. When passed, the estimates will authorize an approximate increase of $1.3 billion in expense funding and $750,000 in capital investments funding for the government. Of this funding, the 2 highest expenses are $373 million for the Small and Medium Enterprise Relaunch Grant Program as part of Alberta's recovery plan, and $324 million for the Department of Health's pandemic response. Thank you.
Motions. Motion number 67. Honourable Mr. Taves.
The Honourable the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now move government motion number 67. Be it resolved that the message from the Honourable Lieutenant Governor, the 2020-2021 supplementary supply estimates number 2 for the General Revenue Fund and all matters connected therewith be referred to the Committee of Supply.
Honourable members, this is a debatable motion according to Standing Order 18.1I. Are there anyone wishing to speak? The Honourable Official Opposition House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister of Finance for moving this important motion. The supplementary supply process is such a critical part of the budgetary processes for the Government of Alberta. The official opposition looks forward to the opportunity to review in detail some of the numbers that the Minister of Finance has just spoken to in this House. We believe that this is a critical form of accountability, and we look forward to that opportunity. Thank you.
Seeing none, I am prepared to ask the Minister to close debate should he choose to do so. Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, does the Assembly agree to the motion? If so, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. My opinion, the ayes have it. The motion is carried and so ordered.
Government motions. Motion number 68. Honourable Mr. Taves.
The Honourable President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I now move government motion number 68. Be it resolved that pursuant to the Standing Order 61-2, the Committee of Supply shall be called to consider the 2020-2021 supplementary supply estimates number 2 for 3 hours on Tuesday, March 16th, 2021.
Members, this is not a debatable motion pursuant to Standing Order 61-2. Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, does the Assembly agree to the motion? If so, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 211, Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act 2020. Ms. Glasgow.
The Honourable the Member for Brooks, Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of Bill 211, the Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act. I want to start by thanking the Minister of Municipal Affairs, the Premier, and the Government House Leader for identifying Bill 211 as being an integral part of our government's agenda, so much so that they are providing time to debate it as if it were a government bill. As a private member, I know that this is a great privilege, and I am honored to bring this issue before the House on behalf of the constituents of Brooks Medicine Hat. But, Madam Speaker, the issue doesn't just affect the over 51,000 constituents that I am proud to represent. It affects the property rights of thousands across the province. Imagine this, Madam Speaker. You're driving down the road. Perhaps you're in a new place. You've never driven there before. And all of a sudden, the speed limit changes. You unknowingly are going too fast, and you come home to a big fat fine and a not-so-pleasant mailer from the Ministry of Justice and Solicitor General. Now, any judge will tell you that it is your responsibility as a driver to ensure that you are obeying the rules of the road, and that responsibility comes with having a driver's license. In this case, you're going to have to pay that fine, of course, and likely get made fun of by your spouse, but more than likely, you'll move on unbothered. You're probably thinking, Madam Speaker, how does this relate to firearms? But the newly proposed federal legislation has the potential to create this kind of unintentional unlawfulness, but on a much larger scale with significantly more serious consequences. The federal government, to appease the likes of Toronto, is contemplating a law that allows municipal governments to pass bylaws prohibiting certain firearms within their municipalities with little to no evidence. The same situation has the potential to occur for those with possession and acquisition license, or PALs for short, or firearms licenses. And through this proposed legislation, the federal government is overreaching into a realm of provincial authority to allow municipalities to create a patchwork of bylaws to restrict handguns. Unlike in the case of violating another bylaw, like, say, a traffic infraction, those caught violating this, as it is a firearms law, would receive a criminal offense. Their life would be forever changed. They would likely lose all their firearms that are otherwise legal and could even serve time in jail. Those with restricted PALs are subject to even more strict guidelines than the average license holder. For those members who may not be aware, Albertans and Canadians, for that matter, who own handguns have a restricted license. They have to. They have willingly gone through more testing and more training, and all in the name of safety. Canadian firearms owners are among the most honest and law-abiding citizens in this country. In fact, they strive to follow all rules and regulations while keeping their safety as the chief objective. Under the Federal Firearms Act, the RCMP runs the name of restricted PAL holders through the Canadian Police Information Centre, or CPIC, every single day. Madam Speaker, every single day. Many in my riding of Brooks Medicine Hat own firearms. A significant amount of them even own restricted firearms. Since many elected officials don't even seem to have a cursory understanding of this topic, handguns in Canada fall under that category in Canada's criminal code. If you own a restricted firearm, the same act states that you must travel on the most direct route possible between where the firearm is stored and the approved firing range or similar venue. Let's use a local example. Now, let's pretend that you live in the south side of Cypress County and you are a member of the range in the north end of Medicine Hat. Let's also pretend that you own a restricted firearm and the City of Medicine Hat decided to pass a bylaw restricting that firearm. And for what it's worth, Madam Speaker, the City of Medicine Hat has not stated that they have any intention to do this. It's just for the sake of debate. The easiest path would be to head down Highway 1 through the city to get to the range. But what if you don't have access to any other roadway? In this case, you would be forced to violate the law, punishable by a criminal code offense for otherwise safely transporting that firearm. That's the kind of unintended consequence created by a patchwork handgun ban. With the passage of the federal legislation, firearms owners will need a vast knowledge of individual municipal bylaws across the provinces. It creates potential issues that are wrought with confusion. Albertans deserve as much clarity as possible on the laws of the land, and Bill 211 will give them that clarity, Madam Speaker. Our federal government seems to think that creating more barriers for law-abiding citizens will somehow earn them more seats in Liberal ridings, curb gang violence that's a growing plague for population-dense areas like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. But I have news for them, Madam Speaker, it won't do that. There isn't a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, and passing the buck and burden onto municipal governments will only cause frustration and needless time in our already busy courts. Implementing a local handgun ban in Redcliffe or Rosemary or Medicine Hat won't help to curb gang violence in downtown Toronto or crack down on a smuggling ring bringing in sawed-off shotguns across the border from through Toronto. You know, Madam Speaker, instead of putting a Band-Aid on the problem, we could just vaccinate the disease. But as recent events have taught us, the feds don't exactly have an excellent track record when it comes to supplying vaccinations. Let's unpack this for illustration's sake. The federal government had an opportunity to show Albertans that they are serious about getting tough on criminals who are smuggling guns across our borders and using them in the drug trade in our communities. They had an opportunity, Madam Speaker, to demonstrate to Albertans and all Canadians that C-21 wasn't just virtue signaling to the woke Hollywood elite types. They could have increased funding to the RCMP so that they could work with programs like ALERT, which successfully, and just this week, confiscated $160,000 worth of presumably illegal firearms, drugs, and paraphernalia from dangerous members of our society in southern Alberta. The violent crimes and gangbanging that the federal government is killing us that this will mitigate are not perpetuated by law-abiding farmers, ranchers, hunters, and sports shooters. In fact, these crimes were committed by lawful gun owners. It would be a statistical anomaly. Between 2003 and 2010, Stats Canada reported that just 3% of all murders involved legally acquired firearms. On top of that, CBC reported in 2019 that the majority of all gun crimes come from illegal sources in Canada, like smuggling. So they could strengthen our international borders, but instead they are planning to spend millions on a buyback problem in an attempt to pacify law-abiding firearms owners, which will no doubt fail, Madam Speaker. Finally, the Trudeau Liberals could support previous initiatives and legislation that actually gets tough on criminals, like the Harper-era mandatory minimums for those who are accused of firearms offences. Instead, they are rolling back these with one hand, all the while vilifying hundreds of thousands of firearms owners across the country with the other hand. Frankly, Madam Speaker, I've heard from thousands of Albertans on the issue of firearms. The fact that this House, a provincial government, even needs to consider protecting these rights and expedite a private member's bill to this effect demonstrates just how needed this legislation truly is. We told Albertans that we would fight for a fair deal, Madam Chair. We told them that we would have their backs. Bill 211 helps limit the ever-encroaching hand of government on the private lives and property of law-abiding, rule-following citizens. At such a time as this, when governments are forced by a global pandemic to take extraordinary action in the name of public health, it is the least that we can do to protect citizens and their private property from nonsensical gun grabs. As part of their master plan, the federal Liberals plan to buy back the lawfully obtained heirlooms, tools, and firearms of Albertans. Some of these firearms are truly priceless or quite costly, either because of their rarity, their age, their caliber, you name it. The Liberals don't even know what the plan will cost Canadians, Madam Chair. It seems to be a monolithic principle of the left that the government has an endless resource that appears in excess out of nowhere. They forget that the same dollars that they are using to buy back lawful gun owners' property first came from them, the taxpayers, Madam Speaker. And I have a concern, Madam Speaker. Why is this federal government passing the buck on administering sections of the Criminal Code? The Firearms Act states that violations are subject to penalty under the Criminal Code of Canada. And the last time I checked, that was the responsibility of the federal government. But with their proposed legislation, they want local municipal governments to decide where the code applies. I think there are serious questions if their action of overreach is even constitutional, and I know that there are amazing grassroots organizations fighting the Liberals in court over this very issue, so I'll let the judges take care of that. But the question remains, if the feds want to shirk their responsibilities by passing the buck to municipalities, why are they then trying to bypass provincial governments as well? Thankfully, the Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Blair, has openly stated that they do not intend to impinge on the rights of provinces to regulate municipalities. However, Madam Speaker, we all know several roads that were paved with good intentions. Let me be clear. It's not that I think local municipal governments are incapable of thoughtful debate and legislation. In fact, I believe the opposite. I work with several Reeves, mayors, and councillors within my own constituency, and I hold them in the highest regard. The point is, they have enough problems to deal with. They shouldn't have to spend valuable time on this. To be effective, local municipalities would need to work with surrounding communities with military-like precision. It is the job of the provincial and federal legislators to decide these matters. Madam Speaker, sport shooting is a sport enjoyed by thousands of Albertans. Whether it's hunting, clay shooting, or even just a day out at the range, our province is home to law-abiding, responsible firearms owners, and as the chair of the Alberta Firearms Advisory Council, I have heard from thousands of them. I want to take this time to thank all of the incredible Albertans who served on the Alberta Firearms Advisory Committee. I also want to thank the exceptional team of department staff that assisted me, as well as committee members, in drafting our report to the Minister of Justice. In my opinion, Madam Speaker, Peter, Brittany, Marlon, Jonah, and the team at the Ministry of Justice are truly public servants. Not only did they put up with me and my energy for months, they served concerned Albertans with care and diligence. Now, Madam Speaker, some friends in the media have criticized this bill, and I guess that's their right, but just like with Saskatchewan's Bill 194, Bill 211 is a solid provincial solution to a federally created problem. The Saskatchewan legislature moved that municipal legislators should not be forced to enact, should not be able to enact bylaws related to firearms without being ratified by provincial cabinet. Bill 211 accomplishes the same thing. It's a common sense solution. On the surface, to those who are not intimately connected to the firearms community, who are innocently unaware, and that's okay, it may seem like the federal Liberals' new law may take steps to curb violence and curb violent crime in cities that struggle with gun violence. But the truth is that Bills C-71 and C-21 do very little to protect Canadians and a whole lot to penalize and create red tape, the violation of which results in criminal sanctions. I would encourage all who are skeptical to think of this issue through good old-fashioned common sense. Take emotion out of it. Let's take politics out of it even. So, since when do gangbangers, drug dealers, and gun smugglers care about obeying the law? Do you think that a criminal is going to hand over their weapon before committing a violent crime because an inconsistently applied bylaw is in their way? No, Madam Speaker. The RCMP on their website said that there is an estimated over 300,000 plus firearms license owners in our province and over 2 million, across Canada. Believe me, Madam Speaker, if there were an issue with legal gun owners, we would undoubtedly know about it. We are being penalized for being overwhelmingly law-abiding. Can you imagine if we weren't? So, Madam Speaker, I want to encourage every member of this House to fully support Bill 211, the Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act. Firearms aside, I think that we can all agree that the law more broadly needs to be clearly defined and evenly applied, no matter where you live. Having an inconsistent patchwork does not and will not work. For the sake of demonstration, I present to you my final metaphor. Imagine if the city of Calgary decided to use the imperial system. You're driving along and all of a sudden signs are posted in miles per hour instead of kilometers. Not only would you be confused or driving way under or possibly way over the speed limit, but if it wasn't posted properly, you could actually do harm to others or yourself. Trying to shield yourself from that fine, even the worst lawyer would tell you that the ignorance of the law is no defense. And some will say with indignation that nobody needs an insert type of gun or caliber here, but I will wrap up with this. Less government interference is a cornerstone of conservatism, and as is the protection of private property and individual liberty. These are the values of hundreds of thousands of Albertans. They are foundational values that I was elected upon in both my nomination and upon which the United Conservative Government built a platform. Madam Speaker, this bill, Bill 211, fundamentally protects Albertans and their lawfully acquired private property. I'm reminded of a quote by one of my favorite conservatives, former President Ronald Reagan, who said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Firearms owners know how it has gone in the past when the government came to help. Nationally, we had the long gun registry, and one doesn't need to look back too far to remember when the RCMP confiscated firearms in High River during the 2013 floods. Bill 211 takes an essential step forward for our province in ensuring that we get a fair deal as part of the Federation. This issue came up when the Fair Deal panel traveled across the province, and in response, our government is appointing a chief provincial firearms officer as our commitment to standing up for our lawful citizens. It's another signal to Ottawa that we can handle our own. In fact, we're happy to do it. The best place for government to be, of course, is out of our lives and out of our business. If my colleagues keep these comments in consideration, I believe that the only logical solution, no matter where on the House you sit, is to pass Bill 211 in an expeditious manner. With so much on the shoulders of government and their leaders these days, be it the global pandemic or a recession not seen in decades, I have to say that I am humbled that Alberta's government would choose to expedite the passage of my private member's bill and allow me to introduce it today. It is proof that this government listens to all members, even those who are not in cabinet. I look forward to hearing the debate on this bill and answering questions from my colleagues in Committee of the Whole, and it's truly an honour to be moving second reading of Bill 211 today.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Hear. Any other members wishing to join the debate? The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Appreciate the opportunity to speak in favour of Bill 211. Obviously, when we look at what the federal government has done with the gun legislation and regulations in Canada here recently, we see that this is an issue of property rights. We know that we should all be able to lawfully possess, that we have the right to peacefully possess property. And of course, when we look at legislation like they've been bringing forward, we see that this takes away the rights of Albertans and Canadians to peacefully own their own property. Now, when we look at this Bill 211 itself, and as far as the federal government wanting to allow municipal governments to pass bylaws that can restrict possession of firearms within their jurisdictions, we realize that this is actually provincial authority or federal authority, but it is not municipal authority. Now, obviously, when we could see problems with different jurisdictions having different rules, and as you're transporting a firearm from, say, home to a gun range, if you pass into a different municipality and you're not familiar with the laws of that municipality, or maybe don't even know that you've passed into that municipality, then obviously you could be committing an offense that you have no idea that you're doing. And of course, if you're charged under one of these actions, these criminal actions, the results of that could be very damaging. It could restrict your ability to travel. It could restrict your ability to get a job or have a certain occupation. So we need to be certain when we pass laws like this and have legislation like that in this province that we don't put people in that situation like that. Now, we know that firearms owners in Canada are already licensed. They already, the law-abiding firearms owners are licensed. They've, for the most part, had education and training for to possess that license, or have had to prove that they have those abilities. Now, obviously, when we see the legislation coming forward that's trying to restrict the rights of licensed, law-abiding firearms owners, we have to push back on this. We know that our licensed firearms owners are law-abiding, and they do their best to promote safety, and they already have many restrictions already. For instance, handguns are already registered. There's already restrictions on transporting handguns. When we look at rifles, there's rules with safe storage of firearms, and so there's a myriad of regulations and restrictions already on firearms in Canada. And of course, adding more and more regulations and rules and restricting more and more firearms, and then having a federal government trying to allow municipalities to make rules on top of the existing rules, it just doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, I don't think everybody knows the rules of the municipalities that they might travel through. I know Obviously, with speed limits and things like that, there should be signs out. That should be fairly straightforward. But when a municipality could, pass a legislation or regulation to restrict different types of firearms within their municipality, that's something that people won't know, and possibly until it's too late, and that's not acceptable. And of course, when we look at the problems with firearms, the problems with firearms are crimes committed with firearms, and of course, we know that many of those firearms that are used in committing these offenses are smuggled in. And of course, when we look at these bills and regulations that the federal government has been bringing in, none of them affect the criminals. They only affect the law-abiding citizens. And of course, we need to make sure that these regulations and legislation doesn't attack law-abiding citizens. We need to be focusing on the problem, which is the criminals. And of course, that just doesn't seem to be the way the federal government's been working on this. When we look at the buyback program, for instance, it's going to be obviously expensive and ineffective. People that have, in good faith and in sincerity, have went out and purchased firearms, will all of a sudden be forced to sell their firearm to the government. And of course, that just doesn't make sense when it comes to property rights. So again, I just think it's unreasonable that the federal government could pass on this responsibility to municipalities, and bypassing the provincial government in the meantime. And so that's why Bill 211 is so necessary, and that's why we need to support Bill 211. And I want to thank the honourable member for bringing Bill 211 forward, and of course the government for bringing it into this place here where we can debate it fully here. Now, when I look at the lawful firearms owners that I know, some of them just go to the range and shoot, target practice, and sporting clays and things like that. They have that opportunity to do different kinds of styles of shooting at these gun ranges, and also we of course have hunters that go out and during the hunting season and enjoy the opportunities to hunt game and enjoy the proceeds of that, the meat that they get to feed their families with. And of course, we have trappers also that use firearms in their business. And again, when we look at outfitters, of course I know that industry fairly well, and of course that's a big part of tourism in Alberta. And obviously, anytime governments are seen to be anti-gun or any of these sports, that hinders that opportunity for that tourism to happen, and that we don't want to see our economy being affected by things like gun legislation that just doesn't make sense. Now, so this Bill 211, this is a provincial solution to a federally created problem, and obviously it's too bad that we have to be in that situation where we have to try to solve problems that the federal government has created, but that's where we are here today. We need to use common sense. This all goes back to common sense. We know we have criminals breaking the law, using firearms illegally, and that's where our focus needs to be. We need to keep our focus on the problem instead of wandering around in Never Land trying to attack law-abiding citizens. And so again, we have to keep a focus on what makes sense, and that's keeping firearms out of the hands of criminals, and we can do that by better protecting our borders. But we're not going to do that by buying guns back from law-abiding citizens. Now, of course, we've committed in our campaign to appoint a chief firearms officer. And I think the government is well underway in that process right now. So we'll look forward to that happening. But when we look back at this federal government banning 1,500 models of guns, and mostly by looks, and not by what the gun can do. So you could have a gun that does the exact same thing as the one that's banned, but it isn't banned. And this doesn't make sense. We need to, and they use the term assault weapon. Well, that the only weapon that's an assault weapon is one that's used by somebody to assault somebody. Other than that, weapons are used for, like I say, for target practice, for hunting, trappers use them, and things like that. And so obviously that term assault is actually has a very negative connotation to it, and justifiably so when they are used for that purpose. And that's something that, of course, none of us here in this room support. Again, we need to focus on the illegal activity. We've seen that the federal government has reduced mandatory punishment for criminals committing crimes with firearms, which is just completely counterproductive to what they insist that this legislation is supposed to do, that the federal legislation that they've been bringing forward. So we got to remember that firearms are important to our economy. We have lots of businesses that employ people manufacturing and selling firearms. And we need to realize that it's an important part of not only our economy, but of course the province of Alberta, and especially rural Alberta. You know, a lot of landowners, farmers use firearms to protect their livestock at certain times of the year when they're susceptible to predation. And obviously anything we do to restrict that opportunity for law-abiding citizens to protect their property, their livestock, is obviously it's unacceptable. Again, so I guess in closing, I just want to say again that I support Bill 211. This is about common sense. This is about making sure we don't make criminals out of law-abiding people, and hopefully it'll help focus the issue on criminals, which is where it should be. Thank you very much.
Any other members wishing to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary, McCall.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak to Bill 211, Municipal Government Firearm Amendment Act, which has now made to government agenda, and it's on order paper as a government bill. Might as well note that seldom bill from opposition even makes it to this House. So this bill made to the government order paper. I've heard with interest both speeches, both remarks, and I think in last little while there was a recess, I didn't hear from even one constituent anything about federal ban or new federal legislation. Anyone I met in my constituency, first and foremost, they're concerned about their lives and their livelihoods. And over the period of last year, in particular last 6 months, Calgary Northeast, Upper Northeast, those areas, the areas I represent, including those areas, they saw the highest number of per capita COVID infections, highest in the province. The schools, many of them, they saw outbreaks. I do personally know students, kids in my constituency, in my community, who have been asked to isolate 3 to 4 times. So when I talk to my constituents, they talk about these infections. They talk about spread of COVID-19. They talk about outbreaks in our schools. And for many of them in that area, in my riding, they don't have the luxury of working from home. They are in kind of jobs that they cannot do from home. They are frontline staff. They have to get up and be on front lines to fight COVID-19. So they are concerned about this pandemic and spread of this virus in their homes, in their communities, in their schools. And this pandemic, like many other Albertans, certainly have impacted their livelihoods as well. And even before the pandemic, we saw 50,000 jobs lost in Alberta. They were struggling even before the pandemic. Just in Calgary alone, the vacancy rate in downtown Calgary is at 30%. And despite the government claims that tax handouts are working, every day we are seeing more job losses. In Calgary, we are seeing more job losses in Alberta. Companies like Encana, they are taking those handouts and they are just packing up altogether to move to United States. Some are taking those handouts, laying off Albertans, and then they merge with each other so nobody finds out where that money went. So these are the kind of issues that my constituents talk about. And in particular in Northeast Calgary, in last little while, we have seen a spike in crime and gun-related, gang-related violence. Just a few months or so ago, I was reading some stats about Calgary, that there were 112 shootings just in the city of Calgary in 2020, which is an increase of 23% over 2019. While in 2018, there were only 46 shootings. Madam Speaker, this shows how prevalent this issue has become. And we do know that our law enforcement, women and men in uniform, they are doing everything they can to address this issue. Last year alone, Calgary Police Service, they seized 442 guns in 2020. Again, that was an increase of 20%. And instead of seeing something from this government that will address the issues facing my constituents, issues facing people in Northeast Calgary, issues facing people in Calgary, Edmonton, and all over the province, we are seeing a Bill 211, which only has one substantive provision. And what that provision does, the Municipal Government Act, as it reads now, require municipalities to get Minister responsible for Wildlife Act approval before making any bylaw respecting firearms. And this mighty bill changes that requirement, that now municipality get that approval from the cabinet. That's the only change in this Bill 211. While government is rolling up its sleeve for another jurisdictional dispute for its political gain with federal government, this bill does absolutely nothing for even law-abiding gun owners. Municipalities, before Bill 11, were also required to seek ministerial approval. Now that will be in order in council. That's the only thing that changed. It's a short bill. Anybody can read this one. As I said, that instead of focusing on issues facing Albertans, managing this pandemic better, managing outbreaks in our schools better, managing long-term and senior care better, we are seeing this piece of legislation. And as I said, that it's not clear to me that how government thinks that this bill helps their law-abiding gun owners. I think not only it doesn't help them, it doesn't help us address the issues of crime, issues of gun and gang violence. It doesn't help us address intimate partner violence or gender-based violence that involves use of guns. It doesn't help Alberta address gun smuggling or trafficking. It doesn't simply have those things in here. And it doesn't certainly help people in Northeast Calgary who have been asking this government to take action against gun violence. And when we ask for action from this government, what we are seeing in return, from 2019 budget, for instance, government cut Calgary police budget by $13 million. And in this year's budget, Madam Speaker, there is $65 million cuts for Justice Department. And the government wants us and Albertans to believe that's somehow because of modernization. But when we look into the details, they are actually cutting the very supports that Albertans need at this time to deal with the issues that I identified. Deal with gun violence in our communities. Deal with crimes in our communities. Deal with gender-based violence involving guns in our communities. Deal with gun smuggling and trafficking. But instead, what we are seeing is that there is a cut to ASERT budget. There is a cut to gun gangs and serious crime budget. There is a cut to policing budget. There is cut to courts budget. There is cut to resolution services. All those things that at this point Alberta need to deal with these issues. We are seeing reductions, and if passed, this budget will be reducing from areas that I identified. And I do want to say that federal proposal is flawed also. But Bill 211 doesn't really have any effect on federal ban or on federal proposal, because federal proposal is permissive in its nature, that municipality need to have lawful authorization from the province, being a creator of statute, provincial statute, to have those bylaws within their jurisdiction. So we do have, I guess, questions for the government as well, that with respect to existing provision that they change, is there any record, is there any analysis whether any municipality ever used Section 74, that's now amended, of the Municipal Government Act before? Did ever any municipality try to create a bylaw and seek approval from the minister responsible for Wildlife Act? That would be helpful if government can share that data, and that they can ask from Municipal Affairs Department. It should be available. And I heard about consultations.
Member Standing Order 29-2A is now available. Any members wishing to speak? Seeing none, I see the Honourable Member for Fort Saskatchewan, Vegreville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm honoured to be speaking in favour of Bill 211, the Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act. I'd like to thank the member from Brooks Medicine Hat and the government for bringing this bill and this important issue to the Assembly. I'm proud to represent the many legal firearm owners in my riding, law-abiding citizens who are already following the strict rules that are in place. The federal gun ban targets responsible gun ownership and does nothing to target the people who obtain illegal firearms from across the border. In reality, the federal gun ban is punishing responsible gun owners while encouraging illegal firearms ownership. The vast majority of Albertans are responsible gun owners that take required safety courses in order to get a license and have to get their firearms registered. They also have to go through a personal history section that asks for their criminal history, such as misuse of firearms, mental health history, and suicide attempts. Illegal firearm owners skip that process. We do not have a registry of illegal gun owners, and they can access all types of dangerous illegal firearms. Adding more laws to legal firearms owners is not solving the problem of illegally owned gun-related violence. The problem is not legal firearm access, it's illegal firearm access, and I believe the federal government should be taking more steps to prevent that from happening. I know our provincial government understands this issue very well. We understand the need to continue a thorough process for gun licensing while still allowing freedoms for legal gun owners to continue to operate them safely. It is important that we have a province-wide legislation on firearms instead of having municipal ones. This is because it can get messy with invisible boundaries that create confusion for law enforcement and people trying to obey the law in good faith. And these municipal gun owners will not stop municipal gun laws will not stop illegal firearm owners who already ignore the law. It is imperative that we have an Alberta-made firearm regulation that makes sense for Albertans. We all know Alberta is an amazing place to live, and part of this is a unique identity that we have. For instance, many of us have parents or are farmers and ranchers, or spent our childhood hanging out with the grandparents on the farm, and know having a gun is a necessity. But owning a firearm is not only a matter of safety for a farmer, a rancher, and their family, but also for livestock and poultry. Predators such as coyotes, cougars, wolves, and other targets for livestock and poultry on farms which can produce a significant loss of income for farmers. With firearms, farmers and ranchers are able to use this tool in order to protect themselves, their families, and their livelihoods. And I just wanted to share my personal gun story. My father was a hunter, and he started me very young shooting gophers and teaching me the safe use of a gun. And before I could go on to deer and duck hunting, he made me take the hunter training course. And I remember the time when Scotty and Ringo, our dogs, were out around a cow that just calved, and they were keeping the coyotes away. Using a water hose or a horn or yelling at them would have not chased that pack of coyotes away. It had to be the gun that my father fired. But even though I and many other Albertans grew up around guns, I know there's a right place and time for them. I respect that firearms are powerful and valuable tools. I know how safely to handle one, where to point it at when I'm not shooting, and how to safely store it. Responsible gun owners encourage others to be responsible gun owners. But we have legislators in Ottawa determining gun legislation, an area they know nothing about. Responsible gun owners are not the problem in our province. We also have some municipal leaders who have never owned or even shot a gun or even held a firearm before. This is why it is important that before municipal governments proceed to pass laws on firearms, they need to be authorized by the provincial government to ensure that law-abiding Albertan gun owners have clear and consistent legislation. I know it can cause confusion for a town to have strict firearms laws while a county close by has relaxed firearm laws. Even visitors traveling from different municipalities in the same province would have issues knowing what laws to follow in which town or municipality. It makes a lot more sense to have a province-wide regulation and legislations on firearms rather than to have potentially 352 different municipal firearms laws. I know our provincial government is very capable of providing the guidance needed on gun laws to municipalities. We have had a very capable and well-rounded firearms advisory committee that is chaired by the member from Brooks Medicine Hat. And having an Alberta-appointed chief firearms officer for Alberta will ensure that our unique voices are being heard at the federal level. I know many people are scared of the thought of guns and the horrific acts that have happened, but with responsible firearm education and by continuing the process we have now, we will continue to keep people safe. Our priority should be instead to shift on focusing on illegal firearm ownership to preventing illegal firearms from coming in through our borders, instead of punishing those who have taken the appropriate steps to own and operate firearms. I hope that this Assembly considers the rights of those who have actively taken the lawful steps to obtain firearms. I know that the provincial government will continue to advocate for responsible firearm ownership and that it should be up to the provincial government, not individual municipalities, to set laws on gun regulation. I would again like to thank the member from Brooks Medicine Hat for bringing this important piece of legislation forward that will reduce confusion and set appropriate standards for responsible firearm legislation. I'm honored to speak on behalf of many constituents in Fort Saskatchewan, Vegreville, and Alberta who feel the same way. Thank you.
From a member standing under 29-2A is available for comments or questions. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate on Bill 211 in second reading? The Honourable Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd first like to start by thanking the member from Brooks Medicine Hat for bringing Bill 211 to the floor. I think this is an incredibly important bill. Gun ownership within Canada has been a way of life for many Canadians. Unfortunately, this will drastically change due to a proposition by the Liberal Government of Canada. Liberal Government of Canada is campaigning on a discourse that says gun violence, which we all agree has had devastating impacts on our communities across the country. But I think what's a problem here is that they're stating that specific firearms are the issue. This implies that guns are the main contributors to violence across the country, which is not factual. And also what I think is even more concerning is that within this, they somehow imply that law-abiding gun owners are contributing to this violence, because that seems to be the target of where they're focusing their legislation. Now, the government in Canada, Liberal government in Canada, wants to complete the prohibition of specific firearms, and furthermore, their legislation will make it easier for municipal governments in Alberta specifically to pass laws on firearms. Now, Albertans are known, very well known, as being responsible, trained, and licensed law-abiding gun owners. Being a firearms owner should not categorize you as a contributor to violent crime. This new federal legislation is obsessed with punishing these well-educated and responsible gun owners in Alberta. And it must be recognized that these Albertans are on the right side of the law and obeying the rules. They are not criminals. This is where Bill 211 would come into practice. Now, Bill 211 would act as a firewall against out-of-touch gun policies that punish responsible gun owners and do nothing to tackle illegal guns and illegal gun crime. Crime increasingly dominates the news, and the public is quite concerned, and rightly so, about the criminal violence relating to guns. And now this subject becomes even more heightened when tragedies like the Nova Scotia mass shooting occur. Naturally, the federal government wants to be seen as doing something. Unfortunately, there are no quick fixes when it comes to violence like this. Regardless, the federal government is attracted to waging some symbolic campaign to win votes. Since it's currently fashionable to equate firearms directly with violence, and there is an emotional crusade against firearms, the government sees a political opportunity. Gun control for the Liberal government right now, for them, promises an easy political victory. That is it. Polls show, and I'll admit, polls show that the public is both afraid of firearms, but the polls also show that the bulk of the population in Canada are very unaware of the current firearms legislation and what law-abiding firearms owners have to do to even obtain and, of course, continue to obtain those firearms. Now, with that as well, even if these new laws don't work, the public won't know. And I want to state that the track record of gun control actually reducing criminal violence historically is terrible. It is not good. No government in the world, actually, that has introduced stricter firearms laws can actually boast that this has reduced criminal violence, specifically that relating to gun violence. The federal government's current proposal for stricter gun control would, if introduced, not only fail to reduce crime, but it's even possible that the gun control proposals could increase violent crime. The government's proposal naively assumes that all gun owners are identical. The reality is it's quite different. There are two types of individuals who possess firearms: the ordinary law-abiding gun owner and criminals. Now, the problems posed to public safety by those two groups differs considerably. Now, the legislation in place is more than adequate for the regular average person in Alberta. Legislation such as firearms acquisition certificate, hunting regulations, handgun registration, regulations for storing, handling, and transporting firearms is more than adequate and very strict. It is the violent offender and the criminal that poses the significant threat to the public safety, and our efforts when it comes to guns and gun violence needs to be focused there. It's not rational to fear law-abiding firearms owner. Neither internationally nor within Canada is there a direct link between law-abiding firearms owners and violence. On an international level even, Canada, along with other countries like Norway and Switzerland, have a relatively large number of firearms per capita, but these countries, including Canada, exhibit some of the lowest gun violence rates in the world. And now I'm going to speak even closer to that within Canada. Those regions with some of the most firearms, the rural areas, the most firearms per capita, even have exponentially lower gun violence rates than that. While in the urban areas where there are fewer firearms per capita, that's where they're having the higher rates. This just points exactly to the fact that the guns that need to be targeted are the illegal guns, the guns in the hands of criminals. It's important to understand that legal firearms ownership is not linked with criminal violence, and that firearms legislation has a dismal track in reducing crime or violence. Firearms ownership is a significant part of modern Canadian life, and many Canadians own firearms for hunting or target shooting purposes, and this has been true for many, many years. Canada has some of the strictest firearms laws in the world, and anyone wishing to purchase a firearm must hold a valid firearm acquisition certificate or an FAC. Now, to obtain an FAC, you must subject yourself to a full character investigation by the police and pass a firearm safety course and exam. On top of this, the purchase of restricted firearms and handguns goes even further, which requires extensive permits and very in-depth police background checks. Now, all restricted firearms are registered, and the police permit is required to even transport. Now, this comes from the Chief Firearms Office in Alberta. So you can't even move a firearm. Now, this firearm is only to be transported between a home or place of business in order to shoot the handgun or restricted rifle at an approved shooting range. So when we look at this, the prohibition of certain firearms is naive and misguided for several reasons. Legally owned firearms do not pose a serious threat to Canadians. Firearm bans simply, historically in the past, do not work. And such a ban actually violates our sense of due process by confiscating legally purchased private property. And I think the most important is the campaign to ban firearms is counterproductive, as it draws attention away from the truly effective ways to reduce gun violence. It's important to note that despite well-publicized atrocities, weapons such as restricted firearms and handguns do not pose a serious danger to Canadians when they're in the possession of law-abiding citizens. To put that into perspective, the most common weapon used in criminal violence in Canada is a knife. To add to this, despite decades of research, there has been no solid support or a link found between law-abiding citizens and violence and crime and criminal activity within firearms. Even more importantly, no link has been found between the introduction of firearm bans and the decrease in criminal violence. Finally, the push to ban certain specific guns is counterproductive. It draws attention away, like I said, to the effective ways to fight gun violence. Gun control is not crime control. The government's gun control proposals will not reduce violent crime, suicide, or firearms accidents. The focus needs to be placed properly on policing criminals and illegal weapons crossing the border. Furthermore, the ownership of firearms specifically for hunting have led families for many years to work together to establish practices that are passed down from generation to generation. I know I've done that personally. I have 3 sons. We enjoy firearms for sporting activity and hunting. In fact, there are many families that do this to date, that pass down traditions in hunting to their children. The seizure of these guns and further limits on guns is directly off the path of Alberta's best interests. To speak further on the autonomy that municipal governments could have over firearm legislations, there are multiple problematic areas that arise with this. To start, the power for municipal governments to make firearms laws would have a high possibility of a completely patchwork policy, clouded by hard to establish boundaries that will create confusion for law enforcement and people that are actually trying to obey the law in good faith, which is going to ultimately lead to problems between law enforcement and the public. Secondly, on the question of whether the legislation that is actually being proposed by the federal government will even stop criminals from using illegal firearms, well, you have to just think about that statement. They're not abiding by the law right now anyways. The statistics historically have proven that gun bans are not the answer to criminal activity. This is a fact. I want to express my extreme support of Bill 211. If this legislation passes, Albertans will have the comfort in knowing that they will be protected from laws that are directing at hurting them despite their status as being a law-abiding citizen. With the implementation of Bill 211, Albertans will no longer be concerned over the rights to participate in one of their favorite pastimes, such as hunting or sporting, or concerned about their ability to transfer family traditions and knowledge down to the generations to come. This bill will ensure they retain one of their fundamental freedoms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29, 2A is available. Questions or comments? Seeing none. Any other members wishing to speak? Seeing the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak to Bill 211. So I think what I'd like to open with here is, I had a couple of different remarks set up here. I think what I'd like to open with is that, this bill is short, obviously. It impacts directly the abilities of municipalities to write bylaws. So even though it is billed as sort of counteracting certain federal legislation, it does impact one section of that federal legislation, though certainly not all. And I think really at this point, what we're looking to do is to talk to Albertans about the impact that they see this bill having. So we will be speaking to Albertans about this and consulting with stakeholders going forward. I think too that we want to understand the aims and legal consequences of this bill, and we want to talk to Albertans to understand the impacts that this has on their lives. I think it is worth noting that there are a few things that have been said thus far in this debate that focus more on emotion and rhetoric than they do on fact, and I think it's worth setting the record straight. So I think, by way of debate of this bill, I think the first question I would have to ask would be to the bill sponsor about what exactly the aim of this bill is. She said several times that the concern is that the federal government has taken a quote-unquote cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all solution, and that's extremely problematic. She also said several times that because of the way this bill acts, it allows municipalities to create a patchwork. So those are obviously two problems and two sort of completely opposite problems from each other. One applies the same solution to everything and is problematic in that respect, and the other does quite the opposite of that. So I would be interested to know which problem, in fact, this is intended to solve. I would also like to point out that I think almost every member on the government caucus side has stood and referenced the fact that if we want to stop gun violence, what we really ought to do is have more border services enforcement. I find this an interesting position in light of the fact that we saw repeated cuts to border services, which impacted intelligence, which impacted the ability to find things like child pornography and guns coming into this country. And those cuts took place primarily while our current premier sat around the federal cabinet table. So I think that is a problematic position to say the least, because, I mean, they are right. Certainly we should be investing in those services, but our own current premier was the one who was most injurious to them in recent memory. So I think that's worth discussing. I think another thing, with a bill like this, it's important to keep our language focused on the problem. Certainly, I understand. I do understand the upset of many communities. When I was in government, I had the opportunity to hear the concerns of folks in Northeast Calgary and subsequent to being in government and opposition. Speak to folks in Northeast Calgary who have incredible concerns, and their concerns are completely valid. They are concerns about the safety of their children and their families just going about their daily business. And so those concerns are 100% valid, and I understand why emotions run high when people are talking about the lives of their children, because they ought to run high, I think, in those instances. And so, this is not to suggest that those concerns aren't perfectly valid and that emotion isn't perfectly valid. But I think that sometimes we need to focus on the facts and the science. And so, the member who spoke immediately prior to me sort of referred to, the concerns of these families about their children as a quote-unquote emotional crusade. I think that we should avoid that language, because it is belittling of people that I think have genuine and real concerns. I think as well, when we talk about this distinction, which the previous speaker and several previous speakers made, between ordinary law-abiding citizens and gun owners or ordinary law-abiding citizens, gun owners, and criminals, the distinction is problematic. And it's problematic to me because we lose in that distinction something that is near and dear to my heart that I consider incredibly important, and that is victims of domestic violence. Because for victims of domestic violence, that distinction doesn't break out like that. Yes, it is true that someone is potentially a law-abiding person. They're potentially a law-abiding person owning a gun right up until the moment when they are convicted, and I understand that, but that is the same person. And in the lives of those domestic violence survivors, suggesting that there are sort of criminals running around with gangs and there are regular law-abiding people, that there is a distinction like that, it loses their voice and their experience. And I think that it is really important that we not lose those voices and that experience when we have this conversation. And so that distinction, I think, is not a useful one. Now, admittedly, this is a conversation in which we are dealing with some other weird distinctions. The federal bill is, in my view, by no means perfect. The definition that it attempts to set up is unclear and doesn't necessarily, it doesn't create the line it's necessarily trying to create, because the actual objects, the guns that they are trying to regulate, don't sort of fall neatly into the categories that they are outlining. And so that's problematic. I don't think there's any getting around that. And I have certainly heard concerns about that. But I think, too, that this distinction between criminals and law-abiding people, and this distinction between lawful firearms and unlawful firearms is not quite correct. Again, because a firearm which is lawfully possessed by someone and then misplaced or stolen or somehow finds its way into the hands of another person becomes unlawful. So the actual object itself, again, like the person who becomes a criminal, has not changed. And so that is something that we don't want to lose in this conversation. So all of those are admittedly sort of problematic distinctions. They're problematic from the point of view of the federal bill that this is sort of aimed at. They are problematic from the point of view of the bill that is before us and from the point of view of the debate that we have had so far. So that's sort of a long way around to say that. But that's why, when people are saying, oh, well, this has no impact, this regulating of law-abiding people has no impact on criminals, while Sure, but that's because the statistics lose those people because once they are convicted, then they sort of fall into the other bucket of people, despite being the same individuals. So I think my point here is that, this bill is potentially problematic, potentially helpful. I think it's worth going out and having conversations with Albertans about how this impacts on our lives. But what I would ask all members of this House to do as we move forward in this debate is to consider the lived experience of those domestic violence victims when they talk about these things, and to recognize that distinction when you say there are criminals and there are law-abiding citizens and they're two totally different buckets, it loses the experience of those domestic violence victims. And that is in fact how historically that experience has been lost, is because people were like, oh, well, those are law-abiding citizens and what they do in their own homes with their own family members is their own business. In my view, it isn't. And in fact, that is, in my view, the biggest way we can advance in our fight to decrease domestic violence so that we don't have victims of domestic violence coming forward, is not to draw those sorts of really clear distinctions, because it loses those voices and it loses the experience of those people who are the victims of otherwise law-abiding individuals and who have historically had their voices lost by the fact that neighbors don't want to come forward and sort of testify against their quote-unquote law-abiding neighbors. Now, I'm definitely not suggesting that this is the majority of cases, but I am suggesting that even though it may be a minority of individuals, that lived experience is very real. It's a very serious problem in our society currently. And so anytime we talk about any sort of violence, we need to be continuing to be aware of the fact that those voices and those experiences, they exist, that they are real, and that we should not use language which sort of paints over that experience, because it's extremely problematic. So my hope is that perhaps as we go forward in this debate, we can have a conversation that maybe takes some of that language out of the debate, so that we don't lose those experiences. I also have sort of a few additional questions that I'm hoping that the sponsor / government are able to answer. So one of them is around how many municipalities have used the provision in the current Municipal Government Act, because I think that is relevant to the conversation, because you sort of when you're creating legislation, it's sort of good to look at what the facts are currently and what the facts could potentially be in the future. And certainly it's good to consider the hypothetical, but it's also good to consider the factual. And so factually, I would be interested to know whether municipalities have enacted such bylaws in the past, and sort of what the impact has been on people's lives. And whether anyone has ever been charged under one, because I think that would be interesting information to inform our debate. I think I would be interested to know as well, and I imagine that this is coming forward because the sponsor sort of spoke extensively about recommendations to the Minister of Justice, so I imagine before we're expected to vote on this bill that those recommendations will appear before this House. But I will ask nonetheless to have it on the record, and that is sort of what stakeholders have had to say about this, and ultimately what their advice has been. And as well, I think it would be interesting to hear what this current government is doing to deal with violence involving firearms. So certainly it is absolutely, I think, legitimate for members of this House to stand up and say, we don't think that this is going to work. And so that's a fair and legitimate point for them to make. You know, if that is the case, that they don't think that this is going to work, I'd be interested to hear about steps within provincial jurisdiction that they would be willing to take. Because again, I think that there are concerns from people. Certainly, I've heard from groups of medical doctors who have concerns, ER physicians in particular, you know, about gun violence. And so if the members opposite are taking the position that this doesn't help with that, I would definitely be interested to hear what their proposal is. And certainly policing is a piece of it. I don't for a second suggest that it isn't. I think Alert does fantastic work. They did fantastic work under us. They did fantastic work under the previous government. They do fantastic work currently. And I think that sort of intelligence gathering function is, you know, absolutely a relevant piece, and I certainly hope that going forward they will continue to do that work. But I don't think that necessarily accounts for everything, because, you know, oh man, really?
Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika.
I thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate this opportunity to briefly respond to the member from Calgary Mountain View about her remarks. Sadly, I believe she entirely missed the mark on her speech there, not understanding that there's two problems with this bill, or rather with what she had said. First is she fails to recognize that the federal government's bill on firearms is a gross overstep of jurisdiction. Plain and simple. Trying to bypass the provinces, giving the municipalities the ability to ban certain firearms within their municipal districts. I know that this is nothing new for the members opposite, as they welcomed the NDP, the federal Liberals carbon tax with open arms, rather than challenge that in court, which we're doing now, and actually repealed it with the first bill that was brought forward in this legislature, which I proudly voted in favor of. The second thing is the idea of you know, not addressing valid concerns. I don't, and public consultation. This is not a new topic for this legislature. We have been talking about guns for quite a while now, and rightfully so, because it's not just a matter of whether or not someone should own a gun. This has a lot to do with the ability to do it responsibly, the fact that the federal government is looking to overstep here and make law-abiding citizens who have gone through rigorous training and safety courses to obtain a possession and acquisition license. And the other side of this is, you know, they addressed the very sad and unfortunate reality of domestic violence. This law will not fix the problem of domestic violence. Domestic violence is illegal, full stop. And whether it's a firearm or it's another object, it is an abhorrent thing that happens on a daily basis around the world, and it breaks my heart. But this bill does not fix that problem. And so you want to talk consultation, the member opposite from Calgary Mountain View, though I appreciate her perspective, I think she does miss the mark. And so I have an actual question I'd like to ask her to answer. What experience, if any, does she have with firearms? And will she be supporting this bill?
Any other members wishing to speak under Standing Order 29-2A? Seeing none. Any other members wishing to join debate on Bill 211 in second reading? The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I was enjoying the tone that we had set, and I'm at a crossroads. Do I respond in the tone that the last speaker just used, or do I try to stay on the tone that was being set by previous speakers? And I think I'm going to do my best to opt for the tone that was set by previous speakers. I do want to respond to some of the content, though, that was said in the last 29-2A, and one of the pieces that I will respond to content-wise is around the price on carbon imposed by Ottawa on Alberta. And just, I know there's an attempt to have some revisionist history by some folks in this place, but the facts are that Alberta did have a price on carbon and that money was staying in Alberta. And then absolutely there was very effective framing by the then official opposition and now government around that price on carbon, and they were given a mandate to repeal it. What happened though in the repeal is that it created the space that now, because we don't have an Alberta price, actually we do for heavy emitters, we don't have a Alberta price for all emitters. So what it did is it created this very clear consequence that Ottawa very clearly demonstrated that under their authority as the federal government, jurisdictions that didn't act on a polluter pay system and have a price to and a plan to reduce emissions and to also tax those who don't, that they would impose one on Alberta. So in terms of the facts, what happened is the federal government does have a price on carbon in Alberta, and Albertans are paying it, and that money is not staying in Alberta. That money is going to Ottawa. So in terms of equalization, I would say it would be far more equal if we actually had a government that would step up and show some leadership on the environment and ensure that investments were retained in the province of Alberta and that they actually went to supporting Albertans in reducing emissions, becoming more energy efficient, and growing sectors so in need of economic diversification to keep us as energy leaders in Canada, in Confederation, and arguably in the world. Alberta, if you look back a few decades, had very strong opportunities to invest in wind and in solar and other additional forms of.
Member President Sixiga.
Well, I can appreciate that the member from Edmonton-Kelowna is responding to my 29-2A, which is actually what 29-2A is for. We're talking about Bill 211. We're not talking about energy prices. We're not talking about carbon tax. I referenced it in my response to the member from Calgary Mountain View speech, but this is clearly 23BI, referencing something other than under discussion. So, I mean, I'd love to hear the members' conversation about Bill 211. I think it'd be an excellent thing to get to, but I mean, we are about 3 or 4 minutes into this speech and heard nothing about it, just carbon tax, which we repealed, by the way.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Madam Speaker, and recognizing that we are on the very last few minutes of a very long week of estimates where there's been a lot of heated debate, I would simply say this is not a point of order. The member himself took the debate into that direction. If we don't see a parallel between the government's language of Ottawa overreaching on firearms, Ottawa overreaching on carbon tax, it does seem to all be related. And we are into this is our third speaker on a brand new piece of legislation. We've barely begun. I think, in my opinion, Madam Speaker, and I look forward to your ruling, this is not a point of order. I think we should allow debate to finish itself naturally for this week, go home, have a good weekend, and come back for some more debate next week. Thank you.
I was wondering if we were going to point of order out of the Assembly today here, but I would tend to agree with the honourable members of the official opposition in debate. It does appear to be relevant. However, I'll just caution all members that we are on Bill 211, and as relevant as you can be to the topic at hand is probably helpful. The honourable member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and certainly happy to continue my remarks in response to Bill 211, the government version of the Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act 2020, which one of the things I love about debate when we have an opportunity to speak with students about the purpose of debate is that it gives you a chance to build on the ideas that others have presented before you. So it's my honor to continue to discuss, and I think it shows that I've reflected on things that prior speakers have raised, and that's one of the things that I always challenge students to do, is to build on the ideas of others. So as we continue to debate Bill 211, again, the perfect connection, I think, is Municipal Government Firearms Amendment Act. So again, we're in this place, we're talking about the federal government and the municipal government, and we're the provincial government. So it's interesting that the government's found a way to tie sort of all three orders of government and what this order of government says is an overreach by arguably overreaching in terms of other jurisdictions' authority. And we will build on each other's debate, I'm sure, in the hours to come as it relates to this bill. So that's one of the points that I wanted to raise, is that the UCP government did make a decision to fail to act on Alberta's climate leadership plan and to fail to ensure that that revenue stays in the province of Alberta to fund Alberta initiatives and that it is being sent to Ottawa. So that's how I'm going to summarize the topic that the member opposite raised with that regard. The other thing I want to address from the member's comments and how...
I hesitate to interrupt, but the clock strikes 4:30. The House now stands adjourned until Monday at 1:30.